Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The woods have eyes. I know that now, but on that crisp autumn day when I set out for my solo hiking trip, I was blissfully unaware of the terror that awaited me in the depths of the forest. I'd always been drawn to solitude, finding peace in the quiet whispers of nature that most people never take the time to hear. That's why I chose this remote trail, miles from the nearest town and far off the beaten path. As I shouldered my heavy backpack and took my first steps into the sea of golden leaves, I felt a familiar thrill of excitement. The trek to my cabin was arduous, winding through dense undergrowth and over moss-covered logs. By the time the small wooden structure came into view, my legs were burning, and sweat dampened my shirt despite the cool air. I paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the sight of my home for the next week. It wasn't much, just a simple one-room affair with a tin roof and weathered siding. But to me, it was paradise. As I approached the cabin, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just an oddly shaped shadow stretching across the leaf-strewn ground, but as I drew closer, my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and its shape, it was almost human-like, but distorted, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. I felt a chill run down my spine as I crouched to examine it more closely. The print was fresh, the edges still crisp and undisturbed by wind or wildlife. Whatever had made this track had passed by recently, very recently. My eyes followed the direction of the print, and I saw others, forming a trail that led straight to my cabin. With growing unease, I followed them, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. The prints circled the small building before veering off into the dense forest beyond. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether to continue with my trip or turn back, but the logical part of my brain kicked in, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It must be a bear, I told myself, a large one, walking on its hind legs. That had to be the explanation. And bears were generally easy to scare off with noise and proper precautions. Pushing aside my lingering doubts, I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The familiar musty scent of disuse greeted me as I dropped my pack and began to settle in. I busied myself with unpacking and preparing for the night ahead, all the while trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. As daylight began to fade, I lit the old kerosene lamps and started a fire in the small potbelly stove. The warm glow filled the cabin, and I felt some of my tension ease. I heated up a simple meal of canned soup and settled into the worn armchair with a book, losing myself in the story as darkness fell outside. It was well past midnight when I first heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the cabin's exterior. I lowered my book, straining my ears. There it was again, this time accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a growl, but deeper, more guttural, and unmistakably inhuman. My heart began to race as I set my book aside and slowly rose from the chair. The scratching grew more insistent, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was circling the building. I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on and aiming it at the nearest window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small patch of the forest beyond. For a moment, all I could see were trees and shadows. Then, something moved at the edge of the light. I caught a glimpse of matted fur and a hulking shape before it darted out of view. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I tried to process what I'd seen. It was too big to be a bear, too fast and agile for its size, and the way it moved, almost human-like, but not quite, sent a wave of primal fear coursing through me. The scratching stopped, replaced by heavy breathing just outside the cabin walls. I could hear twigs snapping under immense weight as the creature moved, circling once again. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I was miles from help, with no cell phone signal and no vehicle. I was trapped. Suddenly the cabin was plunged into darkness. The kerosene lamps flickered and died, and even my flashlight beam seemed to dim. I heard a low humming sound, and then the old electric bulb hanging from the ceiling burst with a pop, showering the floor with glass. In the pitch blackness, my other senses seemed to heighten. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart, and most terrifyingly, the slow, deliberate movements of something massive just outside. A new sound joined the cacophony, the creak of wood under strain. Something was pressing against the cabin's walls, testing their strength. I backed away, fumbling in the dark for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands closed around the iron poker from the wood stove, and I gripped it tightly, trying to stop my hands from shaking. The pressure on the walls increased, and I heard the alarming sound of nails pulling free from wood. Whatever was out there, it was trying to get in, and the cabin wouldn't hold it back for long. In desperation, I began to search for a way out. The front door was out of the question. That's where the sounds were coming from. The back door was blocked by fallen logs I'd meant to clear tomorrow. That left only one option, the small window above the bed. I made my way there slowly, feeling my way through the darkness. Just as I reached the window, I heard a deafening crack. The front door splintered, letting in a rush of cold night air, and with it came a smell, a pungent, musky odor that filled the cabin and made my eyes water. My fingers scrabbled at the window latch as I heard heavy footsteps entering the cabin. The floorboards groaned under tremendous weight. I finally managed to unlock the window and began to push it open. That's when I felt it, a blast of hot, fetid breath on the back of my neck. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Slowly, trembling, I turned my head. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I saw a hand, but it wasn't a human hand. It was massive, covered in coarse, dark fur, with long, curved claws that could easily tear me to shreds. The hand moved, reaching for me with agonizing slowness. I didn't think, I reacted. With a scream of terror, I swung the iron poker with all my might. There was a sickening thud as it connected with something solid, followed by a roar of pain and rage that shook the very foundations of the cabin. I took advantage of the moment and hurled myself through the open window, feeling the sting as broken glass cut my arms and face. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs, but fear gave me strength, and I scrambled to my feet, running blindly into the forest. Behind me, I heard the sounds of destruction as the creature burst through the cabin wall in pursuit. Trees whipped past me as I ran, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every stride. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. I had no idea where I was going in the darkness, driven only by the primal instinct to escape. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and I could once again smell that musky, animalistic scent. Just as I felt claws graze my back, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and roots on the way down. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. Above me, I heard the creature's roar of frustration. It paced at the top of the embankment, but for some reason it didn't follow me down. Perhaps the slope was too steep for its bulky frame, or maybe it was injured from our encounter in the cabin. I didn't wait to find out. Ignoring the pain that radiated through every part of my body, I forced myself to my feet and stumbled onward. I walked through the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment to feel those claws on me again. When dawn finally broke, I found myself on the main trail, miles from where I'd started. It was there that a group of early morning hikers found me, bloodied, bruised, and babbling about monsters in the woods. The authorities searched the area, of course. They found my destroyed cabin and the strange tracks around it, but they attributed it all to a bear attack, dismissing my wild claims of something more. But I know what I saw. I know what chased me through those dark woods, and I know that I'll never set foot in a forest again. Because now I understand a truth that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The woods have eyes, and some things in this world are better left unseen. Story 2. The radio crackled to life, piercing the tranquil morning air. Unit 17. We've got another report of mutilated deer near Blackwater Ridge. Can you check it out? Little did I know, answering that call would plunge my partner and me into a nightmare, straight out of a campfire legend. I keyed the mic, stifling a yawn. Copy that. Dispatch. Unit 17 responding. ETA 20 minutes. My partner, Sarah, raised an eyebrow as she sipped her coffee. Mutilated deer again. That's the third report this month. I shrugged, putting the truck in gear. Probably just coyotes getting bold, or some kids messing around. But as we wound our way up the twisting mountain road, a nagging feeling settled in my gut. Something about these incidents felt off. The wounds described in the reports were too severe, too deliberate for normal predator behavior. We parked at the trailhead and geared up. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as we started down the path, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. The forest was eerily quiet, no birdsong, no chattering squirrels, just the whisper of wind through bare branches. About a mile in, we found the first sign of trouble. Sarah spotted it first, a splash of red against the brown forest floor. "John, over here," she called, crouching down to examine the ground. I joined her, my hand instinctively resting on my sidearm. A trail of blood led off the path and into the underbrush, but it wasn't the blood that sent a chill down my spine. It was the tracks. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Massive, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with long claw marks gouging the soft earth. They weren't bear tracks or any other animal I could identify, and they were fresh. Sarah met my gaze, her face pale. "What the hell made these?" I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big, and it's close. We should call for backup." She nodded, reaching for her radio. But before she could call it in, a blood-curdling howl split the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite wolf, not quite human, but a terrifying blend of both. The sound reverberated through the trees, raising goosebumps on my arms. We both froze, eyes scanning the forest around us. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing. "Did you see where that came from?" Sarah whispered, her hand on her holster. I shook my head, straining my ears for any sound of movement. "No, but it sounded close, too close. We need to get out of here and call in reinforcements." We turned to head back the way we came, but something caught my eye. Through the trees, about 50 yards away, I saw a flash of movement. Something large, covered in dark fur, darting between the trunks. "Sarah," I hissed, pointing. "Over there." She squinted in the direction I indicated, then her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she breathed. Standing at the edge of a small clearing was something. It was tall, at least 7 feet, covered in shaggy, dark fur. But it wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its posture unnervingly human-like. Its head swiveled in our direction, and I caught a glimpse of gleaming yellow eyes and a muzzle full of sharp teeth. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. We stared at the creature, and it stared back, an impossible standoff in the quiet forest. Then it let out another bone-chilling howl and charged. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and yanking her into motion. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. I could hear it behind us, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. The sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls spurred us on, terror lending speed to our feet. Sarah stumbled on a root, nearly falling. I caught her arm, hauling her back up without breaking stride. "Come on!" I gasped. "Keep moving!" We burst out of the tree line onto a rocky slope. Without hesitation, we started scrambling up, loose stones skittering away under our boots. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature had emerged from the forest. In the open, I could see it clearly, and my mind reeled at the impossibility of what I was seeing. It was like a wolf, but grotesquely enlarged, and standing upright like a man. Its arms, or were they front legs, ended in wickedly curved claws, and its face, God, its face was a nightmarish blend of human and canine features, with intelligent, predatory eyes that locked onto us with terrifying focus. It began to climb after us, moving with a speed and agility that belied its bulk. Sarah and I redoubled our efforts, our lungs burning as we gasped for air. "There!" Sarah pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face ahead. "We can lose it in there." We made for the opening, squeezing inside just as a massive, clawed hand swiped at the space where we'd been standing. The creature snarled in frustration, trying to force its bulk into the narrow space. We pressed deeper into the crevice, our backs against the cool stone. I could hear the thing outside, pacing back and forth, occasionally letting out that spine-chilling howl. "What is that thing?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know, it's impossible, it can't be real." But I knew what I'd seen, what we'd both seen. It was like something out of an old horror movie or a campfire story. A werewolf, but those were just myths, right? We stayed in that crevice for what felt like hours, listening to the creature prowling outside. Eventually, the sounds grew fainter, then stopped altogether. But we waited longer still, fear keeping us rooted in place. Finally, when the silence had stretched on for a long time, I dared to peek out. The slope was empty, no sign of the monstrous thing that had chased us. "I think it's gone," I whispered to Sarah. "We should make a run for the truck while we can." She nodded, her face pale and drawn. Slowly, cautiously, we emerged from our hiding place. The forest seemed almost normal now, birds chirping as if nothing had happened. But the deep claw marks in the rock face were stark reminders that it hadn't been a shared hallucination. We made our way back down the slope and through the forest, moving as quietly as we could, constantly scanning for any sign of the creature. When we finally reached the truck, we practically dove inside, locking the doors. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to start the engine. "What do we do now? Who's going to believe us?" I ran a hand over my face, my mind racing. "I don't know, but we can't just ignore this. That thing is out there. It's killing animals. What if it decides to go after people next?" We drove back to the station in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. I knew we had to report what we'd seen, but I also knew how it would sound. 2 rangers chased by a werewolf. We'd be laughed out of the service, but as we pulled into the station parking lot, I made a decision. "We tell them everything," I said firmly. "Every detail. If they don't believe us, fine. But we have to try. We have a duty to protect people, and right now, there's something very dangerous in those woods." Sarah nodded, a determined look replacing the fear in her eyes. "You're right. Whatever that thing was, it's real. And it's our job to stop it." As we walked into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had irrevocably changed. The world was suddenly a much stranger, much more dangerous place than we'd ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the dark depths of the forest, a creature that shouldn't exist was waiting. Our encounter in the woods was just the beginning. Little did we know, we were about to embark on a hunt that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world and about ourselves. The line between myth and reality had blurred, and we were standing right on the edge, peering into an abyss of ancient legends come to life. The real question now was, were we the hunters or the hunted? Story 3. The shutter clicked in rapid succession, a staccato rhythm piercing the night. Each flash illuminated a fraction of a second, freezing time in a burst of light. But it wasn't until I reviewed those images that I realized I'd captured something that shouldn't exist, something that turned my solitary camping trip into a nightmare I'll never forget. My name is Alex, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent years tracking elusive creatures through some of the most remote corners of the world, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week alone in the wilderness, capturing images of the local fauna for a nature magazine. I'd done it countless times before, and I relished the solitude, the connection with nature that came from immersing myself in the wild. I set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that seemed to touch the sky. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As night fell, I arranged my equipment, an array of cameras with motion sensors, strategically placed to capture any wildlife that might wander through. The first few days were uneventful. I got some nice shots of deer, a few foxes, even a black bear lumbering through a distant meadow. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I was awakened by the rapid clicking of my cameras. At first, I thought nothing of it, probably just a curious deer or raccoon triggering the sensors. But as the clicking continued, intensifying in frequency, a sense of unease crept over me. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. The forest was eerily still, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the continued clicking of the cameras, punctuated by brief flashes of light that illuminated the trees in stark, ghostly relief. I stepped out of the tent, my bare feet sinking into the cool earth. The clicking was coming from a camera I'd set up about 50 yards away, at the edge of a small stream. As I approached, I swept my flashlight beam across the underbrush, half expecting to see a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. But there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the camera still firing away at regular intervals. With shaking hands, I removed the memory card and inserted it into the viewer I always kept with me. As I scrolled through the images, my blood ran cold. The first few shots showed nothing unusual, just the empty forest floor. But then, in the fifth image, there was something. A dark shape at the edge of the frame, blurry and indistinct. In the next shot, it was closer, more defined. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was a figure, tall and ape-like, covered in dark fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It stood upright, its posture unmistakably humanoid, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed an eerie yellow in the camera flash, intelligent and terrifyingly aware. My hands trembled as I flipped through the remaining images. With each shot, the creature moved closer, its features becoming clearer. The last image in the sequence showed it mere feet from the camera, one massive, hair-covered arm outstretched as if reaching for the lens. I looked up from the viewer, my heart pounding. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I whirled around, the beam of my light cutting through the shadows. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something large moving behind a tree. Then it was gone. Panic seized me. I turned and ran back to my campsite, my feet barely touching the ground. I burst into the tent, zipping it closed behind me as if the thin fabric could offer any protection against whatever was out there. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, every sound amplified by my fear. The soft hooting of an owl became a monstrous growl. The rustle of leaves in the breeze transformed into heavy footsteps circling my tent. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I emerged from my tent, exhausted and on edge. The forest looked normal in the pale morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but my professional curiosity got the better of me. I had to know more. Was what I'd seen real, or just a trick of light and shadow? I spent the day checking and repositioning my cameras, placing them in a wide circle around my campsite. I also set up some new equipment, infrared sensors and night vision cameras that I usually reserved for nocturnal subjects. As night fell again, I retreated to my tent, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening intently, my hand clutching the viewer that held the images from the night before. Around midnight, I heard it, the now familiar sound of my cameras activating, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low, rumbling sound that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground beneath me. Fighting against every instinct that screamed at me to stay hidden, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The cameras were going off all around the clearing, their flashes creating a strobe-like effect that disoriented me. In those brief flashes of illumination, I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something large was circling the campsite, moving with a speed and grace that belied its size. I fumbled with my flashlight, finally managing to switch it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment I saw it clearly. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a disturbing blend of ape and human features, with a pronounced brow and a mouth full of sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, intelligent, curious, and undeniably aware. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pointed directly at me. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet in my haste to retreat. The creature let out a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a howl, but something in between that echoed through the forest and chilled me to my core. I scrambled into my tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip the entrance closed. Outside, I could hear heavy footsteps circling, punctuated by that terrible, otherworldly sound. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror. I don't know if I slept or just passed out from sheer exhaustion, but when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was streaming through the tent walls. The clearing was silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. I emerged cautiously, half expecting to see the creature standing there in broad daylight, but the clearing was empty. At least, that's what I thought, until I noticed the state of my equipment. Every camera had been systematically destroyed, lenses shattered and casings crushed as if by enormous hands. All except one, the original camera that had captured the first images the night before. With trembling hands, I retrieved the memory card and viewed the new images. Most were similar to the ones from the previous night, glimpses of the creature moving through the forest, but the last image made my blood run cold. It showed the interior of my tent, taken from just outside the entrance. And there I was, curled up in my sleeping bag, unaware of the massive figure looming over me, one clawed hand reaching towards the camera. I don't remember packing up camp. I don't remember the hike back to my car. The next clear memory I have is driving down the mountain, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I've spent the week since that night poring over the images, researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what I saw. Some call it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch, but names don't matter. What matters is that it's real, and it's out there. I know I'll go back someday. The need to understand, to document, is too strong to ignore. But next time, I won't be alone. And I'll be better prepared for an encounter with something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. Because now I know the truth. The forests hide secrets darker and older than we can imagine. And sometimes, when you look into the wilderness looks back. Story 4. The distress call crackled through our radios at 2:17 a.m. A hiker, lost somewhere in the dense forests of Blackwood Mountain. Little did we know that answering that call would lead us into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. My name's Mike, and I've been with search and rescue for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that night. It was supposed to be a routine rescue. A guy in his mid-30s, experienced hiker, Somehow got turned around on one of the less traveled trails. It happens more often than you'd think, even to the pros. My partner, Sarah, and I geared up and headed out, our headlamps cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The forest was eerily quiet as we made our way up the trail, the beam of our flashlights sweeping back and forth across the underbrush. Usually, you can hear all sorts of night creatures, owls hooting, small animals rustling in the leaves, but that night, it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. We'd been hiking for about an hour when Sarah stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was our own breathing and the soft crunch of leaves under our boots. Then faintly I caught it, a sound like someone calling for help, so distant it was barely audible. "This way," I said, veering off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. We pushed through the thick foliage, the cries growing louder as we approached. Suddenly, we broke into a small clearing. Our flashlights illuminated a scene that made my blood run cold. A backpack lay on the ground, torn to shreds. Pieces of clothing were scattered around, some hanging from low branches. And there, on a nearby tree, were deep gouges in the bark, claw marks unlike anything I'd ever seen. Sarah crouched down, examining the backpack. "It's his," she said, holding up a wallet. "But where is he?" As if in answer, another cry echoed through the trees. But this time, it didn't sound quite human. It was higher pitched, almost like a wail, and it seemed to be coming from all around us. We exchanged glances, a shiver running down my spine. "What the hell was that?" I muttered. Sarah shook her head, her face pale in the beam of her headlamp. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this. We should call for backup." I nodded, reaching for my radio. But before I could make the call, movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. I swung my flashlight towards it, but it darted out of sight with impossible speed for its size. "Did you see that?" I hissed. Sarah nodded, her hand moving to the holster at her hip. "Yeah, too big for a bear and way too fast." Another wail split the air, closer this time. It was followed by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Now!" We turned to leave, but stopped short. There, blocking our path back to the trail, stood something. In the split second before it moved, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, long limbs, and a face that was almost, but not quite, human. Then it was on us. Sarah fired her gun, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the creature in stark relief. I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes and bared teeth before darkness swallowed it again. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. I could hear it behind us, moving through the forest with terrifying ease. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as it gave chase. The wailing sound came again, but this time it was answered by another cry from somewhere off to our left. "There's more than one!" Sarah gasped as we ran. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't just being chased, we were being hunted. We burst out of the tree line onto a rocky slope. Without hesitation, we started scrambling up, loose stones skittering away under our boots. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. 3 of the creatures had emerged from the forest. In the moonlight, I could see them clearly for the first time. They were tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with long, powerful limbs and bodies covered in shaggy fur. But it was their faces that struck true terror into my heart. They were a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with elongated jaws full of sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. "Up there!" Sarah pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face ahead. "We can lose them in there!" We made for the opening, squeezing inside just as one of the creatures swiped at us with claws that left deep gouges in the stone. We pressed deeper into the crevice, our backs against the cool rock. I could hear them outside, pacing back and forth, occasionally letting out those spine-chilling wails. "What are those things?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. I don't know. They're like nothing I've ever seen before. Almost like Wendigos, she finished for me. From the old Native American legends. I wanted to scoff at the idea, but after what we'd just seen, I couldn't dismiss it. Whatever they are, they're real, and they're hunting us. We stayed in that crevice for what felt like hours, listening to the creatures prowling outside. Eventually, the sounds grew fainter, then stopped altogether. But we waited longer still, fear keeping us rooted in place. Finally, when the silence had stretched on for a long time, I dared to peek out. The slope was empty, no sign of the monstrous things that had chased us. I think they're gone, I whispered to Sarah. We should make a run for it while we can. She nodded, her face pale and drawn. Slowly, cautiously, we emerged from our hiding place. The forest seemed almost normal now, the first light of dawn painting the sky in pale pinks and golds. But the deep claw marks in the rock face were stark reminders that it hadn't been a shared hallucination. We made our way down the slope and through the forest, moving as quietly as we could, constantly scanning for any sign of the creatures. When we finally reached our vehicle, we practically dove inside, locking the doors. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to start the engine. What do we do now? Who's going to believe us? I ran a hand over my face, my mind racing. I don't know, but we can't just ignore this. Those things are out there. They've already killed one person. How many more will die if we don't do something? We drove back to base in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. I knew we had to report what we'd seen, but I also knew how it would sound. 2 search and rescue workers chased by monsters. We'd be laughed out of the service, but as we pulled into the parking lot, I made a decision. We tell them everything, I said firmly, every detail. If they don't believe us, fine. But we have to try. We have a duty to protect people, and right now there's something very dangerous in those woods. Sarah nodded, a determined look replacing the fear in her eyes. You're right. Whatever those things were, they're real, and it's our job to stop them. As we walked into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had irrevocably changed. The world was suddenly a much stranger, much more dangerous place than we'd ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the dark depths of the forest, creatures that shouldn't exist were waiting. Our encounter in the woods was just the beginning. Little did we know, we were about to embark on a hunt that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world and about ourselves. The line between legend and reality had blurred, and we were standing right on the edge, peering into an abyss of ancient horrors come to life. The real question now was, were we the hunters or the hunted? And how do you fight something that, by all rights, shouldn't even exist? Story 5. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the silence. In all my years of camping, I'd never heard a forest so unnaturally quiet. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something bad. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid camper since I was a kid. This trip was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my best friends, Jake and Mia. We'd chosen a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest town or cell signal. The perfect place to unwind and reconnect with nature, or so we thought. The trouble started on our second night. We'd spent the day hiking and exploring, returning to our campsite as the sun began to set. As we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and trading stories, Jake suddenly frowned and cocked his head to one side. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked. Mia and I paused, listening intently. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then faintly, I caught it. A low, rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder, but the sky was clear, stars twinkling brightly overhead. "Probably just an airplane," I said, trying to shrug it off. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't true. The sound was too constant, too organic. We tried to ignore it, to focus on our conversation and the warmth of the fire. But as the night wore on, The sound grew louder, seeming to come from all around us. It was joined by other noises, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, and once a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Mia suggested, her voice tight with barely concealed fear. "This doesn't feel right." I was about to agree when Jake held up a hand, his eyes wide. Guys," he whispered. "Look at the tree line." I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. There, just at the edge of our campfire's light, I saw movement. Something large was moving between the trees, its form indistinct in the shadows. As I watched, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and the gleam of yellow eyes reflecting the firelight. "What the hell is that?" Mia hissed, scrambling to her feet. Before I could answer, the thing in the woods let out a sound that chilled me to my core. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite wolf, not quite human, but a terrifying blend of both. "Get in the tent," I ordered, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Now!" We dove into the tent, zipping it shut behind us, as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. Outside, we could hear heavy footsteps circling our campsite. Something brushed against the side of the tent, and Mia stifled a scream. "What do we do?" Jake whispered, his face pale in the dim light of our lantern. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly through the panic. "We need to get out of here, make a run for the car." "But it's pitch black out there," Mia protested. "And that thing is between us and the trail." She had a point. Our car was parked about a mile away, down a winding forest path. In the darkness, with whatever was out there hunting us, it might as well have been on the moon. "We'll wait till dawn," I decided. "First light, we make a break for it." It was the longest night of my life. We huddled together in the tent, jumping at every sound. The creature, or creatures, as we began to suspect there was more than one, continued to prowl around our campsite. Occasionally, we'd hear that bone-chilling howl, sometimes answered by similar cries from deeper in the forest. As the sky began to lighten, the noises finally subsided. We cautiously emerged from the tent, blinking in the pale morning light. The campsite was a mess. Our food cache had been completely destroyed, its contents strewn across the ground. Deep claw marks scored the trees around us, higher up than any bear could reach. "Well, let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice hoarse. We didn't bother packing up properly. We grabbed our backpacks, stuffed them with whatever essentials we could quickly gather, and set off down the trail at a brisk pace. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. No birdsong greeted the dawn. The only sound was our own labored breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. We moved as quickly as we dared, constantly scanning the trees around us for any sign of movement. We'd been hiking for about 20 minutes when Mia suddenly froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing off to our right. I followed her gaze but saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Then a flash of movement caught my eye. Something large darted between two distant trunks, too quick for me to make out clearly. "Go," I urged, picking up the pace. "Don't run, but walk faster." We pushed on, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. I could hear something moving parallel to us, just out of sight in the dense forest. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of matted fur or a flash of yellow eyes. The trail took a sharp turn, and as we rounded the bend, my heart sank. There, blocking our path, was a massive fallen tree. Its trunk was easily 5 feet in diameter, too big to climb over quickly with our packs. "We'll have to go around," Jake said, already moving to skirt the obstacle. That's when we heard it, the sound of heavy breathing coming from just behind us. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, we turned around. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature. In the clear morning light, I could finally see it properly, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its body was a bizarre blend of human and animal characteristics, powerfully muscled arms ending in massive, clawed hands, legs bent backward like a wolf's, and a head that was neither fully human nor fully bestial. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They were intelligent, aware in a way that no animal's eyes should be, and they were fixed directly on us. For a long moment, nobody moved. We stared at the creature, and it stared back, as if assessing us. Then slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. That broke the spell. Without a word, we turned and ran. We abandoned the trail, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Behind us, I could hear the creature giving chase, its powerful strides easily keeping pace with our desperate flight. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I could hear Mia and Jake panting beside me, feel the vibrations through the ground as our pursuer gained on us. Suddenly, the trees thinned and we burst out onto a rocky slope. Without hesitation, we started scrambling up, loose stones skittering away under our feet. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock face ahead. "We can lose it in there." We made for the opening, squeezing inside just as a massive, clawed hand swiped at the space where we'd been standing. We pressed deeper into the crevice, our backs against the cool stone. I could hear the creature outside, pacing back and forth, occasionally letting out that spine-chilling howl. We stayed in that crevice for hours, too terrified to move. Eventually, the sounds outside faded, but we waited longer still, fear keeping us rooted in place. As the sun began to set, we finally dared to emerge. The slope was empty, no sign of the monstrous thing that had chased us. We made our way down carefully, every sense on high alert. By some miracle, we found the trail again and made it back to our car without further incident. As we sped down the mountain road, putting as much distance between us and that forest as possible, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "What was that thing?" Mia asked, her voice still shaky. I shook my head, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know, it was like something out of a nightmare, a werewolf, or Bigfoot," Jake finished. "It was Bigfoot, or something like it." We fell into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew we'd have to report what we'd seen, but who would believe us? And more importantly, what were we going to do about it? Because one thing was certain, that creature, whatever it was still out there. And I had a feeling our encounter in the woods was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. Story 6. The memory card was supposed to hold nothing more than deer footage. Instead, it contained images that would haunt me for the rest of my life and put me on a collision course with something that shouldn't exist. My name's Jack, and I've been a hunter for most of my adult life. I know these woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. That was before the trail cam changed everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when I headed out to check my cameras. I'd set them up a week earlier, hoping to track the movement of a particularly elusive buck I'd been after. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, and a light mist clung to the forest floor, giving everything an otherworldly appearance. I reached the first camera without incident, swapping out the memory card and moving on to the next. It wasn't until I got to the third camera, the one deepest in the woods, that things took a turn for the bizarre. As I approached the tree where I'd mounted the camera, I immediately sensed something was off. The device was hanging at an odd angle, its casing scratched and dented as if something had tried to pry it off the tree. Frowning, I unstrapped it and examined it more closely. Deep gouges marred the sturdy plastic housing, gouges that looked suspiciously like claw marks, but they were too big to be from any animal I knew. A bear, maybe. But bears didn't usually bother with trail cams. Shrugging off my unease, I popped out the memory card and slid it into the viewer I always carried with me. As I scrolled through the images, my blood ran cold. The first few shots were normal enough, a couple of deer, a fox, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the early hours of the morning 3 days ago, something changed. The images showed a massive dark shape moving into frame. At first, I thought it must be a bear, but as I flipped through the sequence, I realized I was looking at something I couldn't explain. The creature was bipedal, standing upright like a man but covered in thick, matted fur. Its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, legs bent at an unnatural angle, and its face, in one frame, it had turned towards the camera, and I saw a visage that was neither fully human nor fully animal, with gleaming eyes that reflected the camera's infrared flash with an eerie intelligence. My hands shook as I stared at the image, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a hoax, right? Someone in a costume, playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way it moved, the raw power evident in its form. This was no man in a suit. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. The forest suddenly seemed much darker, much more threatening. Every shadow could be hiding something. I shoved the camera and viewer into my backpack and started walking quickly back towards my truck, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. About halfway back, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at my belt. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the trees around me. At first, I saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something large was moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I caught a glimpse of dark fur, a flash of yellow eyes, and then it was gone. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I chose flight. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally burst out of the tree line and saw my truck, I nearly wept with relief. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I climbed inside and locked the doors, I risked a glance back at the forest. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then just at the edge of the trees, I caught sight of a tall, dark figure. It stood motionless, watching me. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I accelerated down the dirt road. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure step out of the tree line, standing in the middle of the road. It raised one massive, clawed hand, as if in farewell. Then I rounded a bend, and it was lost from view. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Bigfoot, a Wendigo, some kind of undiscovered species. Each possibility seemed more far-fetched than the last. But I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes, both what I'd seen in person and what was captured on that trail cam. When I got home, I locked myself in my study and spent hours poring over the images. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that this was no hoax, no misidentified bear or other known animal. This was something else entirely. But what was I supposed to do with this information? Who would believe me? I could already imagine the ridicule if I went public with my story. At best, I'd be laughed off as a kook. At worst, I might find myself the target of unwanted attention, both from skeptics looking to debunk me and from cryptid enthusiasts eager for a glimpse of the creature. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for the time being. But I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. I needed to know more. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I scoured the internet for similar sightings, pored over old newspapers for accounts of strange creatures in the woods, and even reached out to a few trusted friends in the hunting community to see if they'd experienced anything unusual. To my surprise, I found more than I'd expected. While nothing matched exactly what I'd seen, there were enough similar accounts to convince me that I wasn't alone in my experience. Something was out there in those woods, something that had been encountering humans for generations. Armed with this knowledge, I made a decision. I would go back, not to hunt the creature. The thought of harming it felt wrong somehow, but to observe, to try to understand. I spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, and planning my approach. I set up a series of trail cams in a wide perimeter, hoping to track the creature's movements. I brought camping gear, determined to stay out in the woods for as long as it took. As I drove back to that fateful spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. But my curiosity outweighed my fear. I needed answers. I set up camp near where I'd had my encounter, close enough to the area to observe, but hopefully far enough away not to provoke the creature. As night fell, I sat by my small fire, every sense on high alert. For 2 days, nothing happened. I checked my cameras, hiked the surrounding area, but found no sign of the creature. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing when, on the 3rd night, everything changed. I was awakened by the sound of heavy breathing outside my tent. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then, slowly, I reached for the flashlight I kept by my sleeping bag. Before I could grab it, something pressed against the side of the tent. I could see the outline of a massive hand, claws extended, running down the fabric. My heart pounding, I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The pressure on the tent immediately vanished. I heard heavy footsteps retreating, branches snapping under tremendous weight. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows between the trees, and there, at the edge of my campsite, stood the creature. It was even more imposing in person than it had been in the photos. Easily 8 feet tall, with a powerful build that put any bodybuilder to shame. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, deep, intelligent, and undeniably aware. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, to my utter amazement, the creature slowly raised one hand in what could only be described as a wave. It took a step back, still watching me, then turned and loped off into the forest, quickly disappearing from view. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. This creature, this impossibility, hadn't attacked me. It had come to observe, just as I had. And in that moment of mutual recognition, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far greater than a mere animal or undiscovered species. Whatever this being was, it was intelligent, self-aware, and now it knew that I knew about it. As I packed up my camp the next morning, I knew my life had changed irrevocably. The world was a much stranger, much more wondrous place than I had ever imagined. And I had a feeling my encounters with the unknown were far from over. The creature was still out there, watching and waiting, and so was I. Story 7. The scream that pierced the night wasn't human. It was something primal, something ancient, a sound that didn't belong in this world, and it was coming from directly above us. My name is Emily, and I've been rock climbing for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Treacherous weather, equipment malfunctions, even the occasional wildlife encounter. But nothing could have prepared me for what my partner and I experienced on the sheer face of Mount Erebus. It was supposed to be a routine climb. Jake and I had tackled tougher ascents before, and this one was well within our skill level. We'd started early, making good progress up the granite face as the sun climbed higher in the sky. By late afternoon, we'd reached a good spot to set up our portaledge, a hanging tent system that would allow us to sleep on the vertical rock face. As we secured our gear and settled in for the night, the sunset painted the sky in breathtaking hues of orange and pink. We heated up some freeze-dried meals, laughing and joking as we recounted the day's climb. It was perfect, too perfect, as it turned out. The trouble started around midnight. I was jolted awake by a strange sound, a sort of scraping noise coming from somewhere above us. At first, I thought it might be loose rocks or maybe even a small avalanche starting, but as I listened, the sound changed. It became more deliberate. "Jake," I whispered, shaking my partner awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" Just then, the sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. It was a rhythmic scraping, like something with claws was scaling the rock face. Jake's eyes widened as he heard it too. What the hell is that? Before I could answer, another sound split the night. That bone-chilling scream I mentioned earlier. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. It echoed off the mountain face, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We scrambled to unzip the portal edge, peering out into the darkness. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the mountain. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, movement caught my eye. About 50 feet above us, something was moving down the rock face. Something big. In the moonlight, I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid for a human climber, and it was coming straight for us. "Oh my God," Jake breathed beside me. "What is that thing?" I shook my head, unable to speak. As the creature drew closer, more details became visible. It was pale, almost bone-white, its skin seeming to glow in the moonlight. Its body was emaciated, all sinew and sharp angles. But most terrifying of all was its head, elongated and crowned with a pair of enormous antlers. "We need to move," I said, finally finding my voice. "Now!" We scrambled to gather our essential gear, hands shaking as we clipped into our harnesses. The creature was moving fast, covering ground at an impossible speed on the sheer rock face. Just as we were about to start our descent, it let out another of those blood-curdling screams. The sound was so loud, so close, that it seemed to vibrate through the very rock we were anchored to. We began to rappel down as quickly as we safely could, the rough stone scraping against our hands as we moved. I could hear the creature above us, its claws scraping against the rock as it pursued. "Faster!" Jake yelled, his voice tight with panic. I looked up and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was no more than 20 feet above us now, and in the moonlight, I could see its face clearly for the first time. Its eyes were black, pupilless voids that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth was a gash filled with needle-sharp teeth, opened wide in another scream. We hit a small ledge about 100 feet down and paused to catch our breath and reorient ourselves. That's when I noticed the blood. "Jake," I said, my voice shaking, "you're bleeding." He looked down at himself, confused. Then he saw it, a long, deep gash running down his left arm. In our panic to escape, neither of us had noticed the injury. "It must have happened when we were rushing to get out of the portalage," he said, wincing as the adrenaline began to wear off and the pain set in. I quickly pulled out our first aid kit, doing my best to clean and bandage the wound. All the while, I could hear the creature above us, its inhuman cries growing closer by the second. "We need to keep moving," I said, securing the last of the bandages. "Can you make it?" Jake nodded grimly, his face pale in the moonlight. We clipped back into our ropes and continued our descent. The next few hours were a blur of terror and exhaustion. We moved as fast as we dared, the creature always just behind us. Sometimes we could see it, a pale shape darting between outcroppings of rock. Other times we could only hear it, that terrible scraping sound and those ungodly screams. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we finally reached the base of the mountain. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand, and Jake looked ready to collapse. "We made it," he gasped, leaning against a boulder. "We actually made it." I was about to agree when a shadow fell over us. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, we looked up. There, perched on a ledge about 30 feet above, was the creature. In the growing light, it looked even more otherworldly. Its antlers were massive, branching out like a crown of bones. Its limbs were impossibly long and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy, and its eyes, God, its eyes were fixed directly on us with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. For a long moment, nobody moved. We stared at the creature and it stared back. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at us. The message was clear: this isn't over. Then, with a grace that belied its bizarre form, it turned and scaled back up the mountain face, disappearing into a crevice high above. Jake and I didn't stick around. We grabbed our gear and half ran, half stumbled back to our car, constantly looking over our shoulders. It wasn't until we were miles away, speeding down the mountain road, that we finally began to process what had happened. "What was that thing?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "I don't know. It was like something out of a nightmare. A Wendigo, maybe, or some kind of mountain spirit." We fell into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew we'd have to report what we'd seen, but who would believe us? And more importantly, what were we going to do about it? Because one thing was certain, that creature, whatever it was still out there. And I had a feeling our encounter on the mountain was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. In the weeks that followed, Jake and I threw ourselves into research. We scoured old newspapers for accounts of strange encounters on Mount Erebus, reached out to local indigenous groups to learn about their legends, and even contacted a few cryptozoologists, while trying to avoid the really crazy ones. What we found was both fascinating and terrifying. The creature we'd encountered had been sighted before, though never so clearly. It was known by many names in local lore: the Pale Walker, the Antlered One, the Mountain's Hunger, but all the stories agreed on one thing: those who saw it were marked, destined to encounter it again. I'd like to say that we left it at that we moved on with our lives and tried to forget what we'd seen. But the truth is, we couldn't. That creature had awakened something in us, a need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the legend. And so, as I sit here writing this account, I'm also planning our next expedition. We're going back to Mount Erebus, this time prepared not just to climb, but to document, to investigate. We know the risks. We know that the creature is out there, waiting. But we also know that there are truths hidden in those mountains, secrets that have been waiting millennia to be uncovered. And come what may, we intend to find them. Because once you've looked into the eyes of the impossible, how can you ever go back to believing in a mundane world? Story 8. The Loggers. Camp was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Tents lay in tatters, equipment scattered like discarded toys, but it was the tracks that chilled me to the bone. Massive, inhuman prints leading into the yawning darkness of a cave I'd never seen before. As I stood at the entrance, flashlight in hand, I heard a low growl that made my blood run cold. Whatever had done this was still here, waiting in the shadows. My name is Sarah, and I've been a forest ranger for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: the wildfires, lost hikers, even the occasional bear encounter. But nothing in my training had prepared me for what I was about to face. It all started with reports of illegal logging in a remote section of the national forest. As the senior ranger on duty, I volunteered to investigate. It should have been a routine task: document the damage, gather evidence, and report back. I'd done it a dozen times before. The drive out to the site was uneventful, the forest a blur of green and brown outside my Jeep windows. As I neared the coordinates, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, bird song, rustling leaves, the chattering of small animals, had all but disappeared. An unnatural silence hung over the trees, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires. I parked at the end of a rough logging road and continued on foot, following the signs of heavy equipment moving through the underbrush. The destruction was evident: felled trees, churned earth, and the acrid smell of gasoline hanging in the air. After about a mile, I came upon the loggers' camp, or what was left of it. My first thought was that they'd been scared off by our patrols and left in a hurry. But as I drew closer, I realized this was something else entirely. The camp looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Tents were shredded, their contents strewn across the clearing. A large generator lay on its side, deep gouges in its metal casing. What looked like claw marks scored the trunks of nearby trees, higher up than any bear could reach. My hand went to the radio at my belt, ready to call for backup. That's when I saw the tracks. They led from the center of the destroyed camp towards the tree line. At first glance, they almost looked human, a bipedal gait, five-toed. But they were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and the shape was all wrong, the toes too long, ending in what could only be described as claw marks in the soft earth. Heart pounding, I followed the tracks. They led to a part of the forest I didn't recognize, though I thought I knew every inch of this land. The trees here seemed older, gnarled and twisted in strange ways. Their branches formed a canopy so thick that it was like twilight on the forest floor, even in the middle of the day. And there, half hidden by hanging vines, was the mouth of a cave. I'd never seen this cave before. It wasn't on any of our maps, but the tracks led straight inside, as clear as if they'd been painted there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to call for help. But I knew that whatever had done this might still be in there. If there were survivors from the logging camp, they might need immediate help. I couldn't wait. Swallowing my fear, I pulled out my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam of light seemed swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The air was thick and musty, with an underlying smell I couldn't quite place, something wild and musky. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing off the damp stone walls. The tracks were still visible in patches of soft earth on the cave floor, leading deeper into the mountain. As I rounded a bend, my light fell on something that made me gasp. There, propped against the wall, was a hard hat. It was cracked and covered in dark stains that I desperately hoped weren't blood. I picked it up with trembling hands, turning it over. There was a name written on the inside in faded marker. Mike. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. "Is anyone here? I'm a forest ranger. I'm here to help." The only answer was the drip of water somewhere in the darkness and something else. A sound so faint I thought I might be imagining it. A low, rumbling growl. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, definitely real and definitely closer. My light darted around wildly, searching for the source. That's when I saw them. Two reflective eyes in the darkness, watching me. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. The eyes were huge, set too high up to be a bear or any other animal I knew. And there was an intelligence in them, a cold calculation that sent shivers down my spine. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I began to back away. The eyes followed my movement. I heard the scrape of claws on stone, the shift of a massive body in the darkness. That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the cave walls. Behind me, I heard an ear-splitting roar and the thunder of something massive giving chase. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I reached my jeep. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I finally managed to start the engine, I looked back at the forest. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw it, just for a moment, illuminated by my headlights. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape, with eyes that glowed in the light. It raised one massive, clawed hand, as if in farewell. Then it turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me to question whether I'd really seen it at all. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Bigfoot, some kind of undiscovered species. Or was I losing my mind? When I finally reached the station, I sat in my jeep for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the service if I reported a Bigfoot sighting, but I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. Those loggers were still missing, and whatever that thing was, it was dangerous. In the end, I decided to file a report about the destroyed camp and the unexplored cave system. I mentioned tracks from an unidentified large animal, but left out the more unbelievable details. I also requested a search party for the missing loggers, though I doubted we'd find them. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I made a decision. I would go back, Not alone and not unprepared, but I had to know more. Whatever that creature was, it was out there in my forest. And as a ranger, it was my job to understand and protect all the inhabitants of these woods, even the ones that shouldn't exist. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I scoured the internet for similar sightings, pored over old newspapers for accounts of strange creatures in the woods, and even reached out to a few cryptozoologists while trying to avoid the really crazy ones. What I found both fascinated and terrified me. Our region had a long history of sightings, strange, ape-like creatures glimpsed in the woods, unexplained disappearances, and tales of eerie howls echoing through the mountains. Most had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but now I wasn't so sure. I also discovered that the cave I'd found wasn't as unknown as I'd thought. There were old legends about it among the local indigenous people, stories of a spirit cave where a powerful and dangerous entity dwelled. They warned that those who entered rarely returned, and those who did were never the same. Armed with this knowledge, I began to plan my return. I gathered specialized equipment, night vision goggles, a high-powered tranquilizer gun, just in case, and some of the most sensitive motion-activated cameras money could buy. I also recruited help. My old friend Mike, a wildlife biologist, agreed to come along. He was skeptical of my story, but curious enough to investigate. We also brought along Jake, an experienced cave explorer who could guide us safely through the underground system. As we geared up for the expedition, I couldn't shake a feeling of both excitement and dread. Whatever we found in that cave would change everything, our understanding of the natural world, the history of our region, maybe even our place in the grand scheme of things. But as I double-checked my equipment and went over the plan one last time, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. What if we were the ones being hunted? What if, by entering that cave, we were walking into a trap laid by something far older and far more cunning than we could imagine? I pushed the thought aside. We were prepared, we were careful, and we were driven by a need to uncover the truth. Whatever waited for us in the darkness of that cave, we would face it together. As our jeep bounced down the logging road towards our destiny, I found myself filled with a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened, there was no turning back now. The mystery of the creature in the cave was about to be solved, one way or another. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I couldn't help but wonder, were we about to make the discovery of a lifetime? Or had we just signed our own death warrants? Story 9. The voice calling for help came from above, not below. That was the first sign something was terribly wrong. As we stood in the clearing, necks craned upward, searching the canopy for our missing friend, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted by something that didn't belong in this world. My name's Alex, and what was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my closest friends turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and our college buddies Chris and Sarah. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. We chose a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest town or cell signal. The hike-in was challenging but exhilarating. The forest around us, a riot of green and gold in the late summer sun. By the time we reached our campsite, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, we were tired but in high spirits. As we set up our tents and gathered firewood, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, not even the buzz of insects. I mentioned it to Jake, but he just shrugged it off. Probably just the time of day, he said. I'm sure it'll liven up once we settle in. But it didn't. As night fell and we gathered around the campfire, the silence seemed to deepen. Our voices felt muffled, as if the very air was absorbing the sound. Still, we tried to keep the mood light, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was well past midnight when we finally turned in. I drifted off to the sound of the stream and the occasional crackle from the dying fire. I'm not sure what woke me. A sound, maybe, or just that prickling sense of wrongness that sometimes jolts you from sleep. The inside of the tent was pitch black, but I could tell something was off. "Jake," I whispered, reaching out to where my friend should have been sleeping. My hand met empty air. Fully awake now, I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam revealed what I'd already guessed. Jake's sleeping bag was empty, the flap of the tent slightly unzipped. I crawled out of the tent, figuring he'd probably just gone to relieve himself, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was very wrong. Jake's tent wasn't the only one open. All of them were. Sleeping bags spilling out onto the damp ground as if their occupants had left in a hurry. And there, in the dirt near the fire pit, were tracks. Lots of tracks. Some were clearly human, my friend's boot prints. But interspersed with them were other marks, larger and distinctly inhuman. They were roughly foot-shaped, but too big, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. My heart pounding, I called out, "Guys, where are you?" No answer, just that oppressive silence. I was about to shout again when I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help! Somebody help me!" It was Jake's voice, but it wasn't coming from the forest floor. It was coming from above. I looked up, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees around our campsite were massive, old-growth giants with branches as thick as a man's torso, and there, perched on one of those branches at least 50 feet up, was a human figure. "Jake!" I called, my voice shaking. "Is that you? What are you doing up there?" "Alex! Thank God!" His voice was tight with fear. "I don't know how I got up here. One minute I was asleep, the next, 'You've got to help me down.'" I was about to respond when I heard movement behind me. I spun around to see Mia, Chris, and Sarah emerging from the trees. They looked dazed, leaves and twigs tangled in their hair, as if they'd been running through the forest. "Did you guys hear that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. "It sounded like Jake, but—" "He's up there," I said, pointing to the figure in the tree. I don't know how, but I was cut off by another shout, this one from a different direction. "Help! Please! Somebody!" We all turned towards the sound. It was Jake's voice again, but coming from a completely different tree. "What the hell?" Chris muttered. Before any of us could react, more cries filled the air. Jake's voice seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, calling for help from the treetops all around us. "Ah, this isn't possible," Sarah whispered. "How can he be in multiple places?" That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was followed by a sound like heavy raindrops hitting leaves, but there wasn't a cloud in the star-filled sky. Something was moving in the canopy above us, branches swaying and creaking under significant weight, and it was big, way too big to be human. "A run!" I yelled, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her towards the path that led back to civilization. We sprinted through the forest, flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we ran. Jake's voice, or whatever was imitating it, continued to call out from the treetops, always just ahead or behind us, but never where we could actually see him. The growling grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of something massive moving through the trees above us. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as it gave chase. We burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. That's when I saw it, just for a moment, illuminated by our flashlights. A massive shape swinging through the trees with impossible grace for its size. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, long limbs, and a face that was almost, but not quite, human. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness with terrifying speed. "What was that thing?" Mia gasped. Before anyone could answer, we heard Jake's voice again, but this time it was different. It came from the ground, just at the edge of our flashlight beams, and it sounded wrong, distorted, as if something was trying to mimic human speech but couldn't quite get it right. "Help me," it said, in a voice that was Jake's, but also very much not Jake's. "Come closer." "Help me A figure shambled into view, and for a split second I thought it was Jake. But as our lights fell on it fully, I realized with horror that this thing just looked like Jake, a crude approximation made of shadow and twisted flesh. Its mouth opened impossibly wide as it lunged towards us, revealing rows of sharp teeth. We ran again, no destination in mind except away. Away from that thing, away from the voice that wasn't Jake's, away from the nightmare our camping trip had become. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. All I know is that eventually, mercifully, we saw lights through the trees, the ranger station at the trailhead. We burst out of the forest, falling over each other in our haste to reach safety. The startled park ranger on duty took one look at our wild eyes and torn clothes and immediately called for backup. The next few hours were a blur of questions, searchers combing the woods, and our increasingly frantic attempts to explain what we'd seen. They found our campsite ransacked, claw marks gouged into trees and tents alike. But of Jake, there was no sign. Days turned into weeks. Search parties scoured the area but found nothing. We were questioned by police, forest rangers, even FBI agents, but in the end, Jake's disappearance remained a mystery. We tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that night haunted us. We'd seen something in those woods, something that shouldn't exist, and it had taken our friend. It's been 5 years now. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to make sense of what happened. I found other reports. Stories of creatures in the forests of the Pacific Northwest that can mimic human voices, that hunt from the treetops. Some call it a Wendigo, others a skinwalker. The local tribes have their own names for it, passed down through generations. I don't know what to call it. I just know that it's out there, waiting in the darkness between the trees. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear Jake's voice, calling for help from somewhere high above. But I know better now. I know that if I ever hear that call again, the last thing I should do is answer. Because in the deep woods, where ancient things still roam, a cry for help might just be bait in a trap. And once that trap is sprung, there's no escaping the horror that lurks in the canopy above. Story 10. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, and as I huddled in my tent, listening to heavy footsteps circling my camp, I realized with growing horror that I had stumbled upon a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. My name is Dr. Emily Chen, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predator behavior. I've spent years tracking wolves, bears, and mountain lions across some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. But nothing in my extensive training could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. It all started as a routine research expedition. I was setting up a network of remote cameras to study the movement patterns of the local wolf population. The forest was lush and green, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the chattering of small animals seemed muted, as if the whole ecosystem was holding its breath. I brushed off my unease, attributing it to the isolation. It had been days since I'd seen another human being, and the solitude was probably just getting to me. I focused on my work, carefully positioning cameras at strategic points along game trails and near water sources. As the sun began to set on my third day in the field, I set up the last camera for the day. I was about to head back to my campsite when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite wolf, not quite human, but something unsettlingly in between. My scientific curiosity overrode my initial fear. I quickly set up an audio recorder, hoping to capture the sound for later analysis. As I waited in breathless silence, the howl came again, closer this time, It was followed by a series of vocalizations that defied classification, guttural growls interspersed with almost speech-like patterns. Heart-pounding, I retreated to my tent, clutching my satellite phone. I wanted to call for extraction, to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But another part of me, the scientist, was thrilled at the possibility of discovering a new species. I decided to stay the night and check my cameras in the morning. Maybe I had captured something extraordinary on film. Sleep eluded me that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me sitting bolt upright, straining my ears for any sign of the creature. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I emerged from my tent, exhausted but eager to review my footage. I hiked to the nearest camera, my hands shaking slightly as I removed the memory card. As I scrolled through the images on my viewer, my breath caught in my throat. There, in one of the night vision shots, was a figure that defied explanation. It was large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, captured mid-stride as it moved through the forest. Its body was covered in thick, shaggy fur, but its posture was unnervingly upright, not quite human, but far from any known animal. The head was obscured by motion blur, but I could make out the gleam of eyes reflecting the camera's infrared flash. I stared at the image, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a person in a costume, something explainable. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way it moved, the proportions of its body, this was no man in a suit. Determined to gather more evidence, I spent the day checking my other cameras. Most showed nothing unusual, just the typical wildlife of the Pacific Northwest. But 2 more had captured glimpses of the creature, fleeting images that only deepened the mystery. As night fell again, I found myself on edge, jumping at every sound. I was about to turn in when I heard it, that same otherworldly howl from the night before. But this time, it was much closer. I scrambled for my audio equipment, setting it up just outside my tent. The howl came again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was close, too close. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that could only belong to something very large. They were circling my camp, drawing ever closer. I retreated into my tent, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear deep, rumbling breaths, like those of a large predator. For what felt like hours, I sat frozen in terror, hardly daring to breathe. Eventually, the footsteps receded, and the forest fell silent once more. But I knew it was still out there, watching and waiting. When morning came, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The campsite looked undisturbed, but there, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint that made my blood run cold. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. And it was fresh. I knew I should leave, call for extraction and get out of these woods as fast as possible. But the scientist in me couldn't let this go. I had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that could revolutionize our understanding of zoology and evolution. I had to know more, so I stayed. I repositioned my cameras, focusing them more tightly around my camp. I set up additional audio recorders and even laid out some hair traps, hoping to collect physical evidence of the creature's existence. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. Every night I heard the howls, each time seeming to come from a different direction. Twice more, I heard those heavy footsteps circling my camp, but the creature, whatever it was, never showed itself. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I was huddled in my tent, reviewing the day's footage, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the zipper of my tent slowly being opened from the outside. I scrambled back, my hand closing around the canister of bear spray I kept nearby. As the tent flap lifted, I caught a glimpse of a massive, fur-covered arm, ending in a hand with long, curved claws. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I unleashed the bear spray, filling the air with a cloud of burning chemicals. There was a roar of pain and anger, and the arm withdrew. I heard the creature thrashing about outside, howling in agony. I took advantage of the distraction to burst out of the tent, running blindly into the dark forest. Behind me, I could hear the creature recovering, its howls of pain turning to snarls of rage. And then it gave chase. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, but no matter how fast I moved, I could hear it behind me, gaining ground with every stride. Just as I felt claws graze my back, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and roots on the way down. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. Above me, I heard the creature's roar of frustration. It paced at the top of the embankment, but for some reason, it didn't follow me down. Perhaps the slope was too steep for its bulky frame, or maybe it was injured from our encounter at the tent. I didn't wait to find out. Ignoring the pain that radiated through every part of my body, I forced myself to my feet and stumbled onward. I walked through the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment to feel those claws on me again. When dawn finally broke, I found myself on a hiking trail. It was there that a group of early morning hikers found me, bloodied, bruised, and babbling about monsters in the woods. The authorities searched the area, of course. They found my destroyed campsite and the strange tracks around it, but they attributed it all to a bear attack, dismissing my claims of something more fantastic. But I know what I saw. I know what chased me through those dark woods, and I have the evidence, the photos, the audio recordings, even a tuft of coarse, unidentifiable hair caught in one of my traps. I've spent the years since that night analyzing the data, reaching out to cryptozoologists and folklore experts, trying to make sense of what I encountered. I've heard it called many things: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods. But names don't matter. What matters is that it's real, and it's out there, sometimes on quiet nights. I can still hear that howl in my dreams. And I know that somewhere, in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, a creature that defies scientific explanation is roaming free, waiting to be discovered, or to discover its next unsuspecting victim. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows between the trees, and one day I'll find it, because once you've looked into the eyes of the impossible, how can you ever go back to believing in a mundane world? Story 11. The massive footprint in the mud stopped me dead in my tracks. It was easily twice the size of my own boot, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. As I crouched to examine it, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the darkening forest. I slowly raised my head, my flashlight beam cutting through the twilight, to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the underbrush. My name is Jack Reynolds, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwater National Forest for over a decade. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but that night showed me just how wrong I was. It all started with a series of strange reports from campers and hikers. They spoke of eerie howls in the night, glimpses of something large moving through the trees, and a general sense of being watched. At first, we chalked it up to overactive imaginations and the usual wildlife. This is bear country after all. But as the reports kept coming in, each more unsettling than the last, we knew we had to investigate. That's how I found myself deep in the forest as dusk was falling, miles from the nearest campground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and an unusual quiet had settled over the woods. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that set my nerves on edge. I'd been hiking for hours, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed vegetation that seemed too high up and too forceful to be from any normal wildlife. That's when I came across the footprint. As I examined it, my mind raced through possibilities. A bear, maybe. But the shape was all wrong, too elongated, and with those distinct claw marks. And bears don't usually walk on their hind legs for extended periods. The growl brought me back to the present. I slowly stood up, my hand instinctively going to the tranquilizer gun at my hip. We'd been issued them recently, along with orders to capture any unusual wildlife we encountered. Now, facing those glowing eyes in the gathering darkness, I was grateful for its reassuring weight. "Hello!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Reynolds. If there's someone out there, please identify yourself." The only response was another low growl, closer this time. I took a step back, my flashlight beam darting between the trees. That's when I saw it, a massive shape, moving with surprising grace for its size. It was covered in dark, matted fur, standing upright on two legs like a man, but far larger than any human I'd ever seen. For a moment, we just stared at each other, its eyes, intelligent and wary, locked onto mine. Then it let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet and charged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I fired the tranquilizer gun, the dart finding its mark in the creature's massive shoulder. But it didn't even slow down. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping under its weight as it gave chase. My lungs burned, and branches whipped at my face as I ran. I broke through the tree line into a small clearing, moonlight illuminating a path ahead. That's when I made a mistake. I looked back. The creature was right behind me, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness of the forest. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was like something out of a nightmare, 8 feet tall at least, with powerful limbs and a face that was a terrifying blend of ape and man. Its mouth was open in a snarl, revealing rows of sharp teeth. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. I rolled onto my back, certain that this was the end. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face as it let out another ear-splitting roar. But then, something strange happened. It stopped, its head cocked to one side, almost curiously, as it looked down at me. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, as it sniffed the air around me. After what felt like an eternity, it took a step back, then another. Its eyes never left mine as it retreated to the edge of the clearing. Then, with one final, almost mournful howl, it turned and loped back into the forest, quickly disappearing from view. I lay there for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet and make my way back to my truck. The whole way, I felt eyes on me, watching from the darkness between the trees. When I got back to the ranger station, I was a mess, clothes torn, covered in scratches and bruises. My colleagues looked at me like I was crazy as I babbled about what I'd seen. They assumed I'd had a run-in with a bear, despite my protests. In the days that followed, I threw myself into research. I pored over old newspapers, local legends, and even reached out to cryptozoologists. What I found both fascinated and terrified me. The creature I'd encountered had been seen before. For generations, there had been stories of a massive ape-like being roaming these woods. The local indigenous people had legends of a wild man of the forest going back centuries. More recently, there had been a string of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but what I'd seen was no lumbering beast. It was intelligent, fast, and far more dangerous than any known animal, and yet it had let me go. Why? I kept thinking back to that moment in the clearing when it had stopped its attack. Had it recognized me somehow, sensed that I wasn't a threat? Or was there something more complex going on, some level of intelligence we couldn't begin to understand? As the weeks passed, the encounters continued. More hikers reported strange sightings, and we found more of those massive footprints scattered throughout the forest. But there were no attacks, no injuries, just fleeting glimpses and that lingering sense of being watched. I went back out into the woods many times after that night, hoping for another encounter. Sometimes I'd hear that distinctive howl in the distance. Once, I even caught a glimpse of a large, dark shape moving through the trees, but I never got as close as I did that first night. The official line from the Park Service was to downplay the incidents, to avoid causing a panic. But word got out, as it always does. Soon, our quiet little corner of the forest was overrun with Bigfoot hunters and thrill-seekers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. As for me, I've developed a new respect for the wilderness I thought I knew so well. There are things out there in the deep woods that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not as separate from nature as we'd like to believe. I still patrol these forests every day, but now I do it with a newfound sense of wonder and caution, because I know that somewhere out there, watching from the shadows, is a creature that shouldn't exist, a being that's both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a reminder of the mysteries that still lurk in the wild places of the world. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the forest falls silent, I swear I can hear its howl echoing through the trees. It's a sound that still sends shivers down my spine, but also fills me with a strange sense of privilege, because I know something that most people don't, that the legends are real, and that the line between myth and reality is far blurrier than we ever imagined. So, if you ever find yourself in Blackwater National Forest and you feel eyes watching you from the darkness between the trees, just remember, you're not alone out there, and the things that go bump in the night might be more real and more intelligent than you ever dreamed possible. Story 12. I never believed in monsters until that night in Blackwood State Park. Now, I can't shake the feeling that something's always watching me from just beyond the tree line. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. As a park ranger, I'd done hundreds of night shifts before, but this one was different. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I climbed into my truck, thermos of coffee in hand. A harvest moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I breathed in the crisp autumn air, tinged with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. "All quiet on the Western Front, eh, Jim?" I called out to my colleague as he finished locking up the visitor center. Jim chuckled, shaking his head. "You say that every time, Mark. One of these days, something's gonna happen just to prove you wrong. If only I'd known how prophetic those words would be." I spent the first few hours of my shift doing the usual rounds, checking campsites, making sure fire pits were properly extinguished, and keeping an eye out for any troublemakers looking to party in the woods. The radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other rangers, but nothing out of the ordinary. Around midnight, I parked at one of the more remote trailheads to eat my sandwich and update my log. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. I was just about to start my engine when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. Now, I'd heard plenty of coyotes and the occasional wolf in my years on the job, but this was different. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human-like in its anguish, and it was close. I switched off my headlights and scanned the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved in the inky darkness beyond its beam. I radioed in to dispatch, "Sierra 12 to base. You copy." A moment of static, then, "Go ahead, Sierra 12. I'm up at Hollow Creek Trailhead. Just heard some unusual animal sounds. Going to investigate on foot. Over. 10-4, Sierra 12. Check in every 15 minutes. Over." I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, sidearm, which I'd never had to use on anything bigger than a snake, and set out along the trail. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, jarringly loud in the stillness of the night. About a quarter-mile in, I froze. There, illuminated in the beam of my flashlight, was a set of tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. But what really sent my heart racing was their shape. They weren't the prints of any four-legged animal. Whatever had made these was walking on 2 feet. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, my hands shaking slightly. Part of me wanted to turn back right then and there, to call in reinforcements or wait until daylight. But I had a job to do, and people counted on me to keep them safe. So I pressed on, following the tracks deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the moonlight. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me spinning around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I smelled it, a rank, musty odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with rotting meat. It was so strong I had to fight the urge to gag. I'd encountered plenty of wild animals in my time, but nothing that smelled quite like this. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Base to Sierra 12, status check, over. I fumbled with the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. Sierra 12 here, still investigating those sounds, found some unusual tracks. I'm about a mile in on Hollow Creek Trail. Over. Copy that, Sierra 12. Be careful out there. Over. As I clipped the radio back to my belt, I heard it again, that same haunting howl, but much closer this time. It was answered by another howl from somewhere off to my left, then another from behind me. My blood ran cold as I realized I was surrounded. I drew my sidearm, my flashlight beam darting from tree to tree. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. A branch snapped loudly somewhere to my right. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of my flashlight's beam was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms ending in wickedly curved claws. But its face, God, its face. It was a twisted mix of wolf and human, with a long snout full of gleaming teeth and eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the darkness. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither moving. I could hear its heavy breathing, see the steam rising from its nostrils in the cool night air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot? Werewolf? Some kind of escaped experiment? None of it seemed possible, and yet there it was, right in front of me. Slowly I began to back away, my gun trained on the creature. It cocked its head to the side, almost curiously, then took a step forward. I opened my mouth to shout, to try to scare it off, but all that came out was a strangled whimper. That sound seemed to trigger something in the beast. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of yellowed fangs. It dropped to all fours, muscles bunching beneath its fur as it prepared to spring. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and thorns tearing at my uniform. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footfalls and snarling breaths getting closer with each passing second. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing, the moonlight suddenly bright after the darkness of the forest. My truck was there, just 100 yards away. If I could reach it, I'd be safe. I was halfway across the clearing when my foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt. My flashlight went flying and my gun slipped from my grasp. I scrambled to my hands and knees, desperately reaching for the weapon. A weight slammed into my back, driving me into the ground. Hot, fetid breath washed over me as the creature pinned me down. I could feel its claws digging into my shoulders, piercing through my jacket and into my skin. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then, miraculously, the weight was gone. I heard a yelp of pain, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. I rolled over, gasping for air, to see 2 massive shapes locked in combat at the edge of the clearing. The creature that had been chasing me was grappling with another, even larger beast. This new animal was easily 9 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur. As I watched in stunned disbelief, it lifted the wolf-like creature off the ground and threw it bodily into a tree with a sickening crunch. The new beast turned to face me, and I found myself staring into startlingly intelligent eyes. They weren't the glowing yellow of the wolf creature, but a deep, almost human brown. For a moment I could have sworn I saw something like concern in those eyes, A chorus of howls rose from the forest, and the creature's head snapped around. Without a sound, it loped off into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Eventually, I managed to pull myself to my feet and stagger back to my truck. My radio was full of concerned voices. I'd missed several check-ins, and they were about to send out a search party. I reported that I was fine, just had a fall that knocked me out for a bit. What else could I say? That I'd been attacked by a werewolf and saved by Bigfoot. They'd have me committed. As I drove back to the ranger station, my mind raced. What were those creatures? How long had they been out there? And why had the larger ones saved me? I've been back to that clearing many times since that night, in daylight and after dark. I've never seen the creatures again, but I know they're out there. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can hear their howls echoing through the trees. I still work as a park ranger, but I've switched to day shifts. And every time I see hikers or campers heading out into the deep woods, I want to warn them, to tell them to be careful, to keep their eyes open. Because there are things out there in the darkness, things that most people don't believe in, things that shouldn't exist but do, and sometimes, just sometimes, they're watching us right back. Story 13. I've always loved the solitude of hiking, but after what happened in Raven's Peak, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the wilderness alone again. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, 6 miles round trip to Summit Lake and back. I'd done it a dozen times before, but as I stood at the mouth of that cave, soaked to the bone and shivering in the fading light, I realized how quickly things can go wrong in the backcountry. The day had started perfectly. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, the air crisp and clean after last night's rain. Mist still clung to the towering pines, giving the forest an ethereal quality. I shouldered my pack, double-checked my map, and set off with a spring in my step. The first few miles flew by. I paused occasionally to snap photos of wildflowers or interesting rock formations, but mostly I just reveled in the rhythm of my boots on the trail and the sound of birdsong in the canopy above. It wasn't until I reached the halfway point that I noticed the clouds building on the horizon, dark and heavy with rain. They were moving in fast. I briefly considered turning back, but decided to push on. The lake was only a mile away, and I figured I could wait out any rain under the cover of trees. That decision nearly cost me my life. I was about a quarter mile from the lake when the storm hit. 1 minute I was hiking under gloomy skies. The next, I was in the middle of a downpour. Rain lashed at my face, driven by howling winds that bent the treetops like blades of grass. Lightning cracked overhead, followed almost instantly by deafening thunder. I fumbled for my rain jacket, but it was little use against the deluge. Within minutes I was soaked to the skin, my boots squelching with every step. The trail, normally well-maintained, had become a muddy torrent. Twice I nearly lost my footing on the slick rocks. Realizing the lake was now out of the question, I turned to head back down the mountain. That's when things went from bad to worse. A blinding flash of lightning, a tremendous crack, and suddenly the air was full of splintering wood and falling debris. A massive pine had been struck not 20 yards from where I stood. As it fell, it took 2 more trees with it, completely obscuring the trail. Heart-pounding, I backtracked, looking for a way around. But in the chaos of the storm, with rain streaming down my face and thunder shaking the ground beneath my feet, I must have taken a wrong turn. An hour later, exhausted and chilled to the bone, I had to admit the awful truth. I was lost. The rational part of my brain knew what to do. Stay put. Wait for the storm to pass. Try to get my bearings. But as the temperature dropped and daylight began to fade, panic started to set in. I needed shelter, and I needed it now. That's when I saw it, a dark opening in the rock face to my left. A cave. Relief flooded through me as I scrambled towards the entrance. It was narrow but deep, the perfect shelter from the relentless storm. I switched on my headlamp and ventured inside, grateful to be out of the rain. The beam of my light revealed a cavern about the size of a small bedroom. The floor was relatively flat, with a few scattered rocks. Perfect for waiting out the night, I thought. I shrugged off my sodden pack and began to take stock of my supplies. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They ran along the cave walls in long, deep gouges, as if something with massive talons had been sharpening them on the rock. My headlamp beam trembled as I examined them more closely. Whatever had made these was big, much bigger than a bear. A chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes ran down my spine. I swung my light towards the back of the cave, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. Instead, I saw only darkness and the unmistakable outline of a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. Part of me wanted to run back out into the storm, but the rational voice in my head reminded me that I'd likely freeze to death if I did. Besides, I reasoned, whatever made those marks was probably long gone. This was just an old lair, nothing more. I wish I'd listened to my instincts. I busied myself setting up a makeshift camp, laying out my emergency blanket and changing into the only dry clothes I had, a thin base layer I'd stuffed in a waterproof bag. I forced down an energy bar and some water, then settled in to wait out the night. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling at the cave mouth like a living thing. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. The screen told me it was just past 8 p.m. Exhausted from the day's ordeal, I decided to try and get some sleep. I'd head out at first light and hopefully find my way back to the trail. I'm not sure what woke me. One moment I was asleep, the next my eyes were wide open, heart pounding in my chest. The storm had quieted to a gentle patter of rain. My headlamp had switched off, plunging the cave into total darkness. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the back of the cave. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. It came again, louder this time, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. Something was in the tunnel, and it was coming closer. With trembling hands, I reached for my headlamp. I didn't want to turn it on, didn't want to see what was making those sounds, but I knew I had to. Squeezing my eyes shut, I flicked the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the back of the cave. The tunnel entrance gaped like a black maw, and emerging from it, eyes gleaming in the sudden light, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was vaguely bear-like in shape, but much, much larger. Its fur was a matted, sickly grey, hanging in patches from skin that looked almost leprous, but it was the face that sent pure animal terror coursing through me. The snout was too long, filled with yellowed fangs that protruded past lips pulled back in a permanent snarl, and the eyes, God, the eyes! They glowed with an unnatural red light, filled with a terrible intelligence and hunger. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, we stared at each other. Then the creature let out a roar that shook dust from the cave ceiling and charged. I scrambled backwards, my sleeping bag tangling around my legs. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had. I kicked free, snatched up my pack, and dove for the cave entrance. Rain lashed at my face as I burst into the open air. I could hear the creature crashing through the cave behind me, its growls mixing with the rumble of thunder. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, reduced to the pounding of my heart and the rasping of breath in my lungs. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through me. I was certain that at any moment I'd feel claws tearing into my back, but somehow, miraculously, I stumbled onto the trail. In the grey light of pre-dawn, I could just make out the familiar path. With a sob of relief, I turned downhill and ran as if the hounds of hell were at my heels. Maybe they were. I burst out of the woods and into the trailhead parking lot just as the sun was cresting the horizon. My truck sat there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd see again. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, certain I'd see that twisted bear thing emerging from the tree line. It wasn't until I was miles down the mountain the first houses of civilization appearing along the road, that I finally began to relax. I pulled over, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. What had I seen up there? Some kind of mutant bear, a creature unknown to science? Or had fear and exhaustion caused me to hallucinate the whole thing? I don't know. Part of me doesn't want to know. I filed a report with the park rangers, but I could tell by their faces they didn't believe me. Can't say I blame them. If someone had told me a story like this a day earlier, I'd have thought they were crazy too. But I know what I saw. I know what chased me through that forest. And I know that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I understand that there are things out there in the dark, ancient things, hungry things, things that see us not as masters of nature, but as prey. And sometimes, when I wake in the night and hear the wind howling outside my window, I could swear I hear a deeper sound underneath, a growl, a promise, a reminder that it's still out there, waiting. Story 14. I used to love camping. The crackling of the fire, the smell of pine needles, the stars twinkling overhead. Now, the mere thought of sleeping in a tent makes my heart race and my palms sweat. It's funny how one night can change everything. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just 4 friends escaping the city for some fresh air and ghost stories around the campfire. We had no idea we were about to become part of a horror story ourselves. The trouble started on the drive up. We'd chosen a remote campsite in Blackwood National Forest, about 4 hours from the city. As we wound our way up the mountain roads, the radio started picking up a local station. The host was interviewing some old-timer about local legends. So, Earl, the host was saying, tell us about this Dogman folks around here whisper about. I saw Jake, who was driving, roll his eyes in the rear-view mirror, but Megan and Sarah in the back seat leaned forward, intrigued. The old man's gravelly voice crackled through the speakers. Well, it ain't no ordinary critter, I'll tell you that. Stands 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Built like a man, but covered in fur. Got a head like a wolf, with teeth that had put a grizzly to shame. I chuckled, shaking my head. Sounds like someone's been hitting the moonshine a little hard. But the old-timer wasn't done. Laugh if you want. City folk always do. But I've seen it with my own eyes, heard its howl echo through these hills. It ain't natural, that thing. And it's hungry. Always hungry. Jake reached over and switched off the radio. And, well, that's enough nightmare fuel for one trip. We all laughed it off, but I couldn't help noticing how Megan's eyes kept darting to the dense forest, pressing in on either side of the road. We reached the campsite just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a fire pit in the center. Perfect. We made quick work of setting up the tents and gathering firewood. As darkness fell, we huddled around the crackling flames, roasting marshmallows and trading stories. Okay, my turn, Sarah said, her face gleaming in the firelight. Did you guys know this area is supposed to be haunted? Jake groaned. Not you too. Wasn't that radio show enough? But Sarah pressed on. I'm serious. I did some research before we came. There have been all sorts of strange sightings in these woods, glowing eyes in the darkness, weird howls that don't sound like any normal animal. And let me guess, I said, a monster that's half man, half wolf. Sarah's eyes widened. How did you know? I recounted what we'd heard on the radio. As I spoke, I noticed the forest around us seemed to grow quieter. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of small animals had faded away, leaving only the pop and crackle of our fire. Well, Megan said, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Good thing none of that stuff is real, right? We all murmured in agreement, but I couldn't help noticing how we'd all instinctively moved a little closer to the fire. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. We swapped more stories, sang some off-key renditions of old campfire songs, and eventually turned in for the night. Jake and I took one tent, while Sarah and Megan shared the other. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the screaming started. I bolted upright, heart pounding. For a moment I thought I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, a high, terrified shriek that cut through the night like a knife. "What the hell?" Jake mumbled, sitting up beside me. Before I could respond, there was a sound like ripping fabric, followed by more screams. This time I recognized the voice. Megan. We scrambled out of the tent, fumbling for our flashlights. The scene that greeted us was like something out of a horror movie. Megan and Sarah's tent was in shreds, the nylon fabric torn to ribbons. Sarah was on her hands and knees just outside, gasping for breath. Of Megan there was no sign. "What happened?" I shouted, rushing to Sarah's side. "Where's Megan?" Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror. It took her," she stammered. "Oh God, it took her." "What took her?" Jake demanded. "Sarah, what did you see?" But Sarah just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. That's when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It started low, almost like a wolf's call, but rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. No wolf made that sound, no natural animal could. "We have to find her," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jake, you stay here with Sarah. I'll go look for Megan." Jake grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? You can't go out there alone." "We can't just leave her out there," I argued. "Look, I'll take the bear spray. I'll be careful. But someone has to look for her." Before Jake could protest further, another scream split the night. Megan's voice, filled with pain and terror. Without another word, I grabbed the bear spray and a flashlight and plunged into the forest. The beam of my light seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness of the woods. Every shadow looked like a lurking monster, every rustle of leaves a stalking predator. I called Megan's name over and over, straining my ears for any response. I don't know how long I wandered through those trees. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the suffocating blackness. My throat was raw from shouting, my legs aching from stumbling over roots and rocks. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from just ahead. My light fell on a small clearing, and there, in the center, was Megan. She was curled up on the ground, not moving, and standing over her, its massive form blocking out the stars, was something. At first glance, it looked almost like a bear rearing up on its hind legs, but as my light played over it, I realized with dawning horror that this was no bear. Its body was covered in shaggy, matted fur, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. And the face, God, the face. It was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with a long snout filled with gleaming fangs and eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the beam of my flashlight. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I could see the intelligence in those eyes, the hunger. This wasn't some mindless beast. This thing knew exactly what it was doing. My paralysis broke when it took a step towards me. I fumbled with the bear spray, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. One moment I was facing the monster, the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Somehow, miraculously, I burst back into our campsite. Jake and Sarah were still there, wide-eyed with fear. "Run!" I screamed. "Get to the car!" We piled into Jake's SUV, engine roaring to life just as a dark shape emerged from the tree line. Jake floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As we fishtailed onto the road, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. A tall, fur-covered figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on our retreating taillights. We drove straight to the ranger station, babbling our story to incredulous faces. They sent out search parties, of course. They found our campsite destroyed, claw marks gouged into trees and tents alike. But of Megan, they found no trace. The official report blamed it on a bear attack, said we were lucky to have escaped with our lives. But we know the truth. We know what's really out there in those woods. I don't go camping anymore. Can't stand the sight of tents, the smell of wood smoke. but sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is right, I swear I can hear a howl in the distance, a sound that's almost human, but not quite, and I wonder if it's still out there, still hunting, still hungry, still waiting for its next victim to wander into those dark woods. Story 15. I've been a wildlife biologist for over a decade, but nothing in my years of study could have prepared me for what I saw on that trail camera. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was supposed to be a routine research project. The State Wildlife Department had contracted me to conduct a population survey of large mammals in the Black Rock Mountains. Standard stuff: set up trail cameras, collect data, write a report. I'd done it 100 times before. The first few weeks were uneventful. My cameras captured the usual suspects: deer, elk, the occasional black bear. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as I hiked deeper into the backcountry, setting up cameras in more remote locations, things started to get weird. It began with camera 12, positioned near an old mine shaft about 10 miles from the nearest road. When I went to retrieve the memory card, I found the camera had been knocked off its mount, the sturdy metal casing dented as if something had swatted it. I chalked it up to a curious bear and reset the camera. A week later, camera 15 was missing entirely. All I found was a tangle of chewed straps and broken plastic. Again, I assumed it was wildlife, maybe a particularly destructive bear or mountain lion. Frustrated but undeterred, I replaced it with a spare. It wasn't until I got back to my cabin and started reviewing the footage that the real strangeness began. Most of the clips were what I expected: deer grazing, elk moving through in the early morning mist, a fox trotting by with a rabbit in its jaws. But then I came to a clip from camera 12, timestamped 2:17 a.m. 3 nights ago. At first, the frame was empty, just moonlit forest. Then something large moved at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, squinting. It was bipedal, walking on 2 legs, but the gait was all wrong for a bear. Too fluid, too deliberate. The figure paused, turning towards the camera. For a split second, the infrared light illuminated its face. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. The face was elongated, almost wolf-like, with a short muzzle and pointed ears. But the eyes were unmistakably intelligent, gleaming with an awareness that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could make out any more details, a long-fingered hand reached out and swatted the camera. The video cut to static. I sat back, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just seen? Some kind of hoax, a person in a very realistic costume. But who would be out here, miles from civilization, in the middle of the night? I must have watched that clip 100 times over the next few days, analyzing every frame. Part of me wanted to write it off as a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I needed more evidence. I headed back out into the field with a renewed sense of purpose. This time, I set up multiple cameras at each site, hiding them more carefully. If whatever I'd seen came back, I was determined to capture it clearly. For 2 weeks, nothing. Just normal wildlife, though I noticed the larger animals seemed more skittish than usual. Then 5 nights ago, it happened again. The clip started normally enough, a herd of elk moving through a moonlit meadow. Suddenly, they spooked, bolting in all directions. That's when I saw it. A large, dark figure burst from the tree line, moving with impossible speed. It was bipedal, but ran with a loping, almost canine gait. As it passed directly in front of one camera, I got my first clear look. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in shaggy, dark fur. The arms were long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that stopped my breath. A blend of wolf and man, with a pronounced muzzle full of gleaming fangs and eyes that glowed in the infrared light. The creature paused, scenting the air. Then, with deliberate movement, it turned and looked directly into the camera. Those eyes, they weren't the eyes of an animal. There was intelligence there, and something else. Hunger, curiosity. I couldn't tell. For a long moment, it stared into the lens. Then, moving faster than should be possible for something that size, it lunged forward. The video cut to black. When I hiked out to check the cameras the next day, I found a scene of destruction. All 3 cameras had been smashed, the metal casings torn open like tin foil. Deep claw marks scored the trees where they'd been mounted. I stood there, surrounded by the wreckage, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. This was no bear, no known predator. This was something else entirely, something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to forget this whole project and pretend I'd never seen those videos. But the scientist in me couldn't let it go. I needed answers. I spent the next few days combing through local folklore, searching for any mentions of wolf-like creatures in the area. What I found chilled me to the bone. Stories of the Dogman had circulated in these mountains for generations. Native American legends spoke of shapeshifters that were neither fully wolf nor fully human. Settlers told tales of monstrous wolves that walked on 2 legs. Modern campers reported strange howls and glimpses of large, upright figures in the forest. I was in way over my head. This was no longer a simple wildlife study. I was dealing with something potentially groundbreaking, or potentially deadly. I decided to set up one last camera array, this time with top-of-the-line equipment, high-resolution video, enhanced night vision, motion sensors, the works. If this thing showed up again, I was going to get indisputable proof of its existence. I chose a spot deep in the backcountry, near where I'd had the most sightings. As I finished mounting the last camera, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. Slowly, I turned, scanning the dense forest around me. Nothing moved, but the usual sounds of the woods. Bird song, rustling leaves, had gone silent. The air felt thick, oppressive. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled, heart pounding. There, just visible through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large, moving on 2 legs. Fear paralyzed me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was stand there, watching as a massive, fur-covered figure emerged from the shadows. It was just like in the videos, only 100 times more terrifying in person, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be an impossible blend of human and wolf. The head was unmistakably lupine, with a long muzzle and pointed ears. But the eyes, God, the eyes. They were amber, almost glowing in the dim forest light, and filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was certain that at any moment it would lunge forward and tear me to shreds, but it just stood there, watching me with those unsettlingly knowing eyes. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one long-fingered hand and pointed at the camera I'd just mounted. Then it looked back at me, tilting its head in an almost quizzical manner. The meaning was clear. It knew what I was doing. It understood. A low growl rumbled from its chest, not quite threatening, but definitely a warning. Then, in a blur of movement almost too fast to follow, it turned and vanished into the forest. I don't remember much about my panicked flight back to my cabin. I know I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. By the time I reached my truck, night had fallen. I left all my equipment behind. Let the state wildlife department wonder what happened to their researcher. Some things are more important than a paycheck or professional reputation. I'm back in the city now, trying to make sense of what I experienced. Part of me wants to go public, to show the world the footage I captured. But a deeper, more primal part knows better. Whatever that creature was, dogman, werewolf, or something science hasn't classified yet, it's intelligent, and it knows we know about it now. I can't shake the feeling that by trying to expose its existence, I've opened a door that can't be closed. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear howling in the distance, a sound that's almost but not quite, like a wolf. And I wonder, did I really escape that forest? Or did it just let me go? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I know what's really out there, watching from the shadows, waiting, and I can't help but wonder, what will happen when it decides to step into the light? Story 16. I used to love the snow, the way it blanketed the world in pristine white, muffling all sound. Now, the mere sight of snowflakes falling sends ice through my veins. Because I know what can lurk in that white silence, waiting. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway, just me and Sarah, escaping the city for a long weekend at a cozy mountain lodge. We'd been planning it for months, a chance to reconnect, to rekindle the spark that had been fading lately. If only we'd checked the weather forecast more carefully. The drive up had been uneventful, just a light dusting of snow on the ground as we wound our way up the mountain road. Sarah was giddy with excitement, already planning our itinerary. "We'll go skiing tomorrow," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Then maybe a sleigh ride in the evening? Oh, and we have to try that little restaurant in town. I hear their hot chocolate is to die for." I smiled, her enthusiasm infectious. "Sounds perfect. Though right now, I'm looking forward to curling up by the fire with you." She laughed, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Easy there, Tiger. We've got all weekend for that." If only we'd known how wrong she was. The storm hit when we were about an hour from the lodge. One minute we were driving through a winter wonderland. The next, we were in the middle of a whiteout. Wind howled around the car, driving snow so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of us. "Maybe we should pull over," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Wait it out." I shook my head, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're almost there. It'll be worse if we get stuck on the side of the road." I'd replay that decision in my head 1,000 times in the days to come. We crept along at a snail's pace, the world outside reduced to a swirling mass of white. The GPS was useless, losing signal in the mountains. I was relying on memory now, hoping I remembered the route correctly. That's when I saw it, a massive shape, looming out of the storm directly in our path. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. We hit the fallen tree with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. For a moment, everything was silent except for the hiss of steam from the crumpled hood and the relentless howl of the wind. Then Sarah's voice, shaky but alive. "Tom, are you okay?" I nodded, too stunned to speak at first. We were alive, but the car was dead, and we were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in the worst storm I'd ever seen. "We have to get help," I said, finally finding my voice. "The lodge can't be far." "We'll walk." Sarah looked at me like I was crazy. "Walk in this? We'll freeze to death." But I was already rummaging in the back, pulling out our heaviest coats and the emergency kit I always kept in the trunk. "We can't stay here. The car's dead, and it's only going to get colder. Our best chance is to keep moving." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. We bundled up as best we could, grabbed what supplies we could carry, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs. Snow whipped around us, stinging any exposed skin. I took Sarah's hand, and together we started trudging through snow that was already knee-deep in places. I tried to keep us on the road, but it was impossible to see. Everything was a uniform white, the wind erasing our footprints almost as soon as we made them. We could have been walking in circles for all I knew. How long we walked, I couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that white void. My legs burned with exhaustion, my face numb from the cold. Sarah stumbled beside me, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. "Tom!" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the wind. I can't go on." I pulled her close, trying to shield her from the worst of the storm. "We have to keep moving. We'll freeze if we stop." That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this world of wind and snow, a long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "What was that?" "Just the wind," I said, but I didn't believe it. That sound had been too deliberate, too alive. We pressed on, but now every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The storm played tricks on our eyes, shapes forming and dissolving in the swirling snow. More than once, I could have sworn I saw something large moving just at the edge of my vision. The howl came again, closer this time, and now I was certain. It wasn't the wind. No natural animal made a sound like that. It started low, almost mournful, but rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. "Tom!" Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "And what's out there?" Before I could answer, I saw it, a dark shape, massive and hunched, moving through the storm with impossible grace. For a moment, just a moment, the snow cleared enough for me to make out details. It was vaguely wolf-like, but far too large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even on all fours. Its fur was a mottled grey, caked with ice and snow, but it was the face that stopped my heart. Not quite wolf, not quite human, with eyes that glowed an eerie yellow in the gloom. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. This creature was intelligent, and it was hungry. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand and plunging forward through the snow. We floundered through drifts that came up to our waists, panic giving us strength we didn't know we had. I could hear it behind us, its heavy breathing and the crunch of snow under massive paws. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I saw a light ahead, a building. We'd found the lodge. "Help!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Somebody help us!" The door burst open, warm light spilling out into the storm. A figure waved frantically, shouting something I couldn't make out over the wind. We were so close, just a few more yards. Something hit me from behind, sending me sprawling face first into the snow. I rolled over to see the creature looming over me, its hot breath fogging in the frigid air. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then Sarah was there, swinging a branch she must have picked up in our flight. It caught the beast across the muzzle with a satisfying thwack. The creature reared back, momentarily stunned. Hands grabbed us, dragging us the last few feet to safety. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the howling wind, and the even more terrifying howl that rose in its wake. We collapsed on the floor of the lodge, gasping for breath. An older man, the innkeeper, I'd later learn, stood over us, his face a mask of concern. "What in God's name were you doing out in that?" he demanded. "And what was chasing you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. How could I explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? Sarah saved me from having to answer. We had an accident," she stammered. "Our car hit a fallen tree. We thought we could walk to the lodge, but we got lost in the storm." The innkeeper's face softened. "You're lucky to be alive. That storm's the worst we've seen in years." He paused, a strange look crossing his face. "But though maybe the storm wasn't the only danger out there?" I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Old stories, that's all. Not fit for city folk like yourselves." But I saw the way his eyes darted to the window, where the storm still raged. That night, as Sarah slept fitfully beside me, I lay awake listening to the wind. And underneath it, just on the edge of hearing, I could have sworn I heard that howl again, a sound of hunger and patience. We made it out when the roads cleared 2 days later. The official report blamed our car accident on the storm, our wild story of being chased on hypothermia and fear. But I know what I saw out there in the snow. I know it's still out there, waiting. These days, I avoid the mountains. I've lost my taste for skiing, for winter hikes, for the silent beauty of snow-covered forests, because now I know what can lurk in that pristine white silence, and I know that someday, somehow, it will be hungry again. Story 17. I used to think the most terrifying thing on a lake at night was the possibility of capsizing. Now I know better. There are things lurking beneath the surface, things that should only exist in nightmares. And sometimes they get hungry. It was Jake's idea to go out on the lake that night. We'd been camping at Shadowmere Lake for 3 days, and so far it had been your typical guy's trip, fishing, hiking, and maybe a few too many beers around the campfire. But on our last night, Jake got that glint in his eye that always meant trouble. "And let's take the canoe out," he said, gesturing towards the lake where a full moon hung low over the water, casting a silvery path across the surface. "Midnight paddle. It'll be awesome." Mike and I exchanged glances. We were all experienced outdoorsmen, but nighttime on the water was a different beast. "I don't know, man," Mike said, voicing my own doubts. It's pretty dark out there." But Jake was already heading for the canoe, his voice carrying back over his shoulder. "Come on, don't be wusses. We've got headlamps. It'll be fine." I should have put my foot down, should have said no. But there's something about being out in the wilderness that makes you want to push boundaries, to test yourself against nature. So against my better judgment, I found myself helping to carry the canoe down to the water's edge. The lake was like black glass, perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a jumping fish. As we pushed off from shore, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the canoe and the soft calls of night birds in the distance. For a while, it was magical. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, creating pools of light on the water. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and open water. We paddled in comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We were about halfway across the lake when it happened. A sound broke the silence. A heavy splash, much larger than any fish, off to our right. "What was that?" Mike's voice was tense. Jake laughed, but I could hear the nervous edge to it. "Probably just a beaver, dude. Relax." I swung my headlamp towards the sound, the beam cutting through mist that had begun to gather on the surface of the lake. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape just below the surface, much larger than any beaver I'd ever seen. But then it was gone, leaving only expanding ripples. "Let's head back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." We turned the canoe, but now the shore seemed impossibly far away. The mist was thickening, obscuring our view of the shoreline. And was it my imagination, or had the temperature dropped? That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was almost like a growl, but deeper, more alien. "Guys?" Mike's voice was barely above a whisper. Please tell me you heard that." Before Jake or I could respond, something hit the bottom of the canoe with enough force to nearly capsize us. We grabbed the sides, hearts pounding as water sloshed over the gunwales. What the fuck was that? Jake's earlier bravado was gone, replaced by raw fear. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. There, not 10 feet from the canoe, something broke the surface of the water. In the dim light of our headlamps, I caught a glimpse of a head, if you could call it that. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in a way that sent ice through my veins. The skin was a sickly grey-green, slick with water and algae. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, empty sockets, and the mouth, God, the mouth. It opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, we stared at each other, 3 terrified humans and this thing that shouldn't exist. Then it sank back beneath the surface, leaving only ripples and the lingering scent of decay. "Paddle!" I screamed, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "Paddle like your lives depend on it." We dug our paddles into the water with frantic energy, the canoe lurching forward. But the shore still seemed so far away, the mist thickening around us until we could barely see a few feet in any direction. Something scraped along the bottom of the canoe, and Mike let out a strangled yelp. "It's under us!" he cried. "Oh God, it's right under us!" I risked a glance over the side and immediately wished I hadn't. Just below the surface, I could make out a massive shape moving alongside us. It was easily as long as our canoe, its body serpentine, but with multiple limbs that ended in webbed, clawed hands. Jake was babbling now, a stream of prayers and curses. Mike was silent, his face a mask of terror as he paddled mechanically. I forced myself to focus on the rhythm, stroke, pull, trying to ignore the splashes and scrapes from the thing pursuing us. We were maybe 100 yards from shore when it attacked in earnest. The canoe suddenly lifted, tipping sideways as something massive rose from the depths beneath us. I caught a glimpse of that terrible face again, jaws opening wide as it lunged for Mike. Time seemed to slow. I saw Mike's eyes widen in horror, saw Jake reaching out in a futile attempt to grab him. Then Mike was gone, pulled into the dark water with barely a splash. The canoe slammed back down, nearly throwing Jake and me into the lake. Water sloshed over the sides, and I knew we were moments away from capsizing. "Swim!" I shouted at Jake, already kicking off my shoes. "Get to shore!" We dove into the frigid water just as the monster, there was no other word for it, surfaced again. I caught a glimpse of it silhouetted against the moon, Mike's limp form clutched in one clawed hand. Then I was swimming, every fibre of my being focused on reaching the shore. The water around us churned and frothed. I could hear Jake gasping and splashing beside me, punctuated by that terrible, otherworldly growl. Something brushed against my leg, a hand, a claw, and I kicked out frantically, my foot connecting with something solid. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my feet touched bottom. Jake and I staggered out of the water, collapsing on the pebbly shore. For a long moment, we just lay there, gasping for breath. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice hoarse. "Mike, is he?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. We both knew the truth. A splash from the lake made us both flinch. I looked up to see a dark shape hovering just beyond the shallows. That face emerged one last time, those empty eye sockets somehow managing to convey hunger and patience. Then it sank beneath the surface, leaving only ripples in its wake. We reported Mike's death as a drowning, a tragic accident during an ill-advised night paddle. What else could we say? Who would believe the truth? The official search found no trace of Mike or the canoe. The lake was dragged, divers sent down, but nothing was ever found. Eventually, the case was closed, written off as yet another wilderness tragedy. Jake and I don't talk much anymore. How can you maintain a friendship when it's built on a shared nightmare? When every time you look at each other, you're reminded of what you saw and what you lost? I avoid lakes these days, can't even look at large bodies of water without breaking into a cold sweat, because now I know what can lurk beneath that calm surface. I know that there are things out there, ancient things, hungry things, that see us as nothing more than prey. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear it, that low, inhuman growl, carried on the wind, a reminder that it's still out there, waiting, hungry, waiting for the next foolish humans to venture out onto its dark waters. Story 18. I've been a hunter all my life, but now I can't even look at my rifle without my hands shaking. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. They're wrong. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some predators were never meant to be hunted. It was the last day of deer season, and I was determined to bring home a buck. I'd been out every weekend since opening day without so much as a glimpse of antlers. My freezer was empty, and my pride was on the line. This was my last chance. I arrived at my favorite spot well before dawn, the forest still shrouded in darkness. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. Frost crunched under my boots as I made my way to the old oak where my tree stand was mounted. With practiced ease, I climbed up and settled in, my rifle across my lap. As the sky began to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold, I allowed myself a moment of peace. This was why I loved hunting, the solitude, the connection with nature, the primal thrill of the chase. The woods came alive as the sun rose, birds began their morning chorus, and I could hear small animals rustling in the underbrush. I remained perfectly still, my eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of movement. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, still no deer. I shifted slightly, trying to ease the stiffness in my muscles. That's when I noticed something odd. The forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if someone had suddenly hit the mute button on the world. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. In all my years of hunting, I'd never experienced anything like this. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I gripped my rifle tighter, eyes darting from tree to tree. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned, trying to locate the source of the sound. Nothing moved in the undergrowth. No flashes of fur between the trees. Just that unnatural silence, broken only by that spine-chilling growl. Then I saw it, or rather I saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow-green, peering out from the shadows of the forest. They were at ground level, then halfway up the trees, then higher still. Whatever these creatures were, they were climbing. I raised my rifle, hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bears, mountain lions. But I knew deep in my gut that this was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. A branch snapped off to my left. I whirled, just in time to see a massive shape detach itself from the shadows of a nearby tree. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, I caught glimpses of matted fur, powerful limbs, and claws that looked like they could rend steel. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. Not quite wolf, not quite human, with an elongated snout filled with gleaming fangs. And those eyes, intelligence burned in those yellow orbs. This was no mere animal. This thing was aware. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I saw my own terror reflected in those alien eyes, but also something else. Hunger. Ancient, primal hunger. My finger tightened on the trigger, but before I could fire, the creature moved. One moment it was at the base of the tree. The next, it was halfway up, climbing with impossible speed. Claws dug into the bark, sending splinters flying as it ascended. I fired, the rapport of the rifle impossibly loud in the silent forest. The creature flinched as the bullet grazed its shoulder, but it didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to move faster, a snarl ripping from its throat that sounded like no earthly animal I'd ever heard. Panic overtook me. I scrambled to unclip my safety harness, nearly falling out of the tree in my haste. The platform shook as the creature reached my level. I caught a whiff of its scent, a rank, musky odor that made my eyes water. With a desperation I didn't know I possessed, I leapt from the stand. For a heart-stopping moment, I was in free fall. Then I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I stumbled to my feet and ran. Behind me, I heard the creature land with a heavy thud. The growl that followed would haunt my nightmares for years to come, but I didn't look back. I ran as I'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face. I could hear it behind me, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my lungs burning, my injured ankles screaming with every step. But I didn't dare slow down. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that if this thing caught me, I was dead. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line into a small clearing. My truck was there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd see again. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys. A howl rose behind me, answered by others deeper in the forest. There were more of them, God knew how many. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as something heavy slammed into the side of the truck. The whole vehicle rocked, and I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes and snapping jaws in the side mirror. I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the mud for a heart-stopping moment before finding purchase. I shot forward, the creature's claws screeching along the metal of the door. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the clearing, watching as I sped away. It made no move to pursue. It didn't need to. We both knew it had won. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. What were those things? How could they exist without anyone knowing? But deep down, I knew the truth. People did know. How many missing hikers? How many animal attack victims? How many mysterious disappearances could be traced back to these creatures? How long had they been out there, hunting in secret? I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a kook, or worse, suspected of foul play in relation to all those missing persons. So I kept quiet, sold my guns, moved to the city, told my family and friends I'd lost my taste for hunting. But the truth is, I'm afraid of the dark spaces between trees, afraid of what might be watching from just beyond the firelight, because now I know that we're not the top of the food chain. We're not the hunters, we're the prey. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear them, a distant howl that's not quite wolf, not quite human, a reminder that they're still out there, watching, waiting, hungry, and I can't help but wonder, how long before they decide to leave the forest? How long before they come hunting in our world? Because if there's one thing I learned that day, it's this. Once they have your scent, they never forget, and they never, ever stop hunting. Story 19. I used to believe that true solitude was the key to finding oneself. Now I know better. Some places are empty for a reason, and some doors are better left unopened, because what comes through might be something you can never unsee or escape. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, soaking through my supposedly waterproof jacket and chilling me to the bone. My boots squelched with every step, and my backpack felt like it weighed a ton. This was supposed to be a soul-searching solo trek through the Appalachian wilderness. Instead, it was quickly turning into a nightmare. Night was falling fast, and I knew I needed to find shelter soon. Hypothermia was a real risk in these conditions. That's when I saw it, a flicker of something through the trees. I blinked, sure I was hallucinating. But no, there it was again, a light. Hope surged through me as I pushed through the underbrush. The trees thinned, revealing a small clearing, and there, like something out of a fairy tale, stood a cabin. It was old, that much was clear. The logs that made up its walls were weathered grey, and moss grew thick on the shingled roof. But it was sturdy-looking, and more importantly, it was dry. I approached cautiously, years of horror movies flashing through my mind. But desperation outweighed caution. I needed shelter, and I needed it now. The porch creaked ominously as I stepped onto it, shielding my eyes from the rain as I peered through a grimy window. The interior was dark, but I could make out the shapes of furniture. It looked long abandoned. "Hello?" I called out, rapping my knuckles on the door. No answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan that set my teeth on edge. Musty air washed over me as I stepped inside, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a simple one-room cabin. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A wooden table and chairs sat in the center, and a narrow bed was tucked into a corner. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, but it was the walls that caught my attention. Every inch of available space was covered in something. As I moved closer, my blood ran cold. They were symbols, hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Carved into the wood, painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, scratched onto scraps of paper that had been nailed to the logs. I recognized some of them, pentagrams, crosses, runes, but others were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Twisting, organic shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly, and there were words, scrawled in a dozen different hands, overlapping and intertwining. Most were in English, but I saw other languages too, Latin, Greek, and some that looked far older. "Keep it closed!" one message screamed in jagged letters. "The door opens both ways," read another, this one in elegant script. "They're hungry," a third warned, "always hungry." A chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes ran down my spine. What the hell had I stumbled into? Part of me wanted to run back out into the storm, but the rational part of my brain argued that this was still better than freezing to death in the woods. Besides, these were obviously the ravings of some madman, nothing to be afraid of. I shrugged off my pack and started to make camp. There was no way I was sleeping in that ancient-looking bed, but the floor would do. I laid out my sleeping bag and changed into dry clothes. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in, but there was nothing but darkness and the constant drumming of rain. I had just started to relax, my body warming up in the dry air, when I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first. But there it was again, a scratching noise, coming from the roof, just a branch in the wind, I muttered to myself. But there was no wind. The storm had settled into a steady, windless rain. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to move, circling the cabin. Whatever it was big. My heart pounded as I stared at the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved. It paused directly over the center of the cabin. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump, it stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the soft patter of rain. Then a new sound began. A heavy, rhythmic thudding. Footsteps. Something was walking on the roof. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The beam danced wildly around the cabin as I spun, trying to cover every corner at once. That's when I saw it. A dark stain spreading across the ceiling, right where the footsteps had paused. It grew larger by the second, water dripping down to form a puddle on the floor. But it wasn't water. It was too dark, too thick. In the beam of my flashlight, it gleamed an oily black. A drop splashed on my cheek. I wiped it away, and my hand came away smeared with something that looked disturbingly like tar. The floorboards creaked behind me. I whirled, my light catching a glimpse of something that made my breath catch in my throat. A shape, blacker than the surrounding darkness, slipping into the shadows. "Who's there?" I tried to shout, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. No answer, just the ever-present drumming of rain and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I backed up until I hit the wall, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The symbols carved there seemed to writhe in the flickering light, as if trying to escape the wood. A low growl filled the cabin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. And underlying it all was a sense of hunger, ancient, insatiable hunger. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. I could see my breath misting in front of me, the sudden cold biting through my clothes. The black ooze on the ceiling began to move, coalescing into a shape that defied description, part shadow, part liquid. It began to stretch towards the floor. I ran. Blind panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I wrenched the door open and burst out into the rain. The storm had worsened, wind now howling through the trees. Lightning flashed, momentarily turning night to day, and in that instant I saw them, shapes in the forest. Dozens of them. Tall, impossibly thin figures with two long limbs and faces that were featureless voids. They stood motionless among the trees, all facing the cabin, facing me. Another flash and they were gone, but I could feel their presence, watching, waiting. I ran. I left everything behind, my backpack, my supplies, all of it. I just ran, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face or the roots that threatened to trip me. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. I was on the verge of collapse when I finally burst out onto a road. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the gloom like a gift from heaven. I flagged it down, babbling my story to the bewildered driver. He clearly thought I was mad, but he was kind enough to drive me to the nearest town. The authorities searched the area, of course, but they found nothing. No cabin, no mysterious symbols, no strange figures in the woods, just miles of untouched forest. I've tried to put that night behind me, Tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and hypothermia. But deep down, I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that growl again, feel those eyes watching me from the shadows. And I know they're still out there, waiting, hungry, because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, and some things, once seen, can never be unseen. So take my advice. If you're ever lost in the woods and you come across a lonely cabin, keep walking. No matter how tired you are, no matter how much you need shelter, keep walking, because you never know what might be waiting inside or what might follow you out. Story 20. They say the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, but after what I've seen, I know the truth is far worse. Sometimes the wilderness hunts, and when it does, no amount of skill or preparation can save you. I've been a park ranger at Black Rock National Forest for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all, lost hikers, animal attacks, the occasional accident, but nothing could have prepared me for that search last autumn. The search that started with 2 missing hikers and ended with something else entirely. It began like any other missing persons report. A young couple, Mark and Sarah, hadn't returned from a day hike to Eagle's Peak. Their car was still at the trailhead, but there was no sign of them on the mountain. As the senior ranger on duty, I assembled a search team and headed out at first light. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that draws hikers to the mountains in droves. Leaves crunched underfoot as we made our way up the trail, calling out for Mark and Sarah every few minutes. We reached the summit by mid-morning with no sign of the missing couple. That's when things started to get weird. "Hey, Ranger Mike," called out Jenny, one of our newer recruits. "And you might want to take a look at this." I made my way over to where she was crouched near the edge of the cliff. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just bare rock and a few scraggly bushes clinging to the mountainside. Then I saw what had caught her attention, footprints, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. And they weren't the prints of any 4-legged animal. Whatever had made these was walking on 2 feet. "What do you make of that?" Jenny asked, her voice tight with tension. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "I'm not sure. Could be a bear that's learned to walk on its hind legs, I suppose. But I've never seen prints like these." As I studied the tracks, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Because now I could see the full trail, and it was following the same path our missing hikers would have taken. I keyed my radio. "All units, converge on the summit. We may have a situation here." Within minutes, the rest of the search team had gathered around the strange prints. Theories were tossed back and forth, everything from mutant bears to Bigfoot, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew this was something beyond our experience. That's when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the canyon. It started low, almost like a wolf's call, but rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. No wolf made that sound. No natural animal could. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Before I could respond, movement caught my eye. About 100 yards down the slope, something large was moving through the underbrush. I caught a glimpse of dark fur, a massive shape that seemed to flow between the trees with unnatural grace. "Everyone stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Whatever that is, it's probably more scared of us than we are of it." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true, because in that brief glimpse, I'd seen something that turned my blood to ice. Eyes, glowing, yellow eyes that held an intelligence no mere animal should possess. We spread out, continuing our search with renewed urgency. The strange tracks led us off the main trail and into a densely wooded area. The trees seemed to press in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. That's when we found the first sign of our missing hikers. A shredded backpack hung from a low branch, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Nearby, half buried in leaves, was a camera, The lens was cracked, but the memory card was intact. With shaking hands, I pulled out my tablet and inserted the card. The last few photos showed Mark and Sarah smiling at the summit, the golden afternoon light painting everything in warm hues. But it was the final image that stopped my heart. It was blurry, clearly taken in a panic. But I could make out a shape in the background, a tall, fur-covered figure with a distinctly wolf-like head, and those eyes, those same glowing yellow eyes I'd seen in the underbrush. A twig snapped somewhere to our left, and we all whirled towards the sound. For a moment, the forest was utterly silent. Then all hell broke loose. A massive shape burst from the undergrowth, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, wickedly curved claws, and those terrible glowing eyes before it was on us. Screams filled the air as the team scattered. I saw Jenny go down, the creature's claws raking across her back. Without thinking, I drew my sidearm and fired. The shot seemed impossibly loud in the confines of the forest. The creature flinched as one of the bullets found its mark, dark blood matting its fur. But it didn't go down. Instead, it turned those baleful eyes on me, lips pulling back to reveal rows of gleaming fangs. Time seemed to slow. I saw the muscles bunch beneath its fur as it prepared to spring. I saw the intelligence burning in those eyes. This was no mere beast, but something far more dangerous. Then it was on me. The impact drove me to the ground, knocking the breath from my lungs. Hot, fetid breath washed over my face as jaws snapped inches from my throat. I fought desperately, my hands tangled in coarse fur as I tried to keep those teeth at bay. Just when I thought it was over, a shot rang out. The creature jerked, then collapsed on top of me. Its weight drove the air from my lungs, and for a moment, I thought I'd be crushed. Then hands were pulling me free. It was Rodriguez, the youngest member of our team. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he held his still-smoking pistol. Is it dead?" he stammered. I looked at the creature sprawled on the forest floor. Even in death, it was terrifying. Easily 8 feet long, with powerful limbs ending in curved claws. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and something almost human. "I think so," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Good shot, kid." But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me, because I could have sworn I saw those yellow eyes flicker, just for an instant. We got Jenny stabilized and called for emergency evac. As we waited for the helicopter, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No bird song, no rustling leaves, nothing. That's when I noticed Rodriguez was missing. "Has anyone seen Rodriguez?" I called out, panic rising in my throat. Blank faces looked back at me. In the chaos of the attack, no one had seen where he'd gone. We searched until the helicopter arrived, but found no trace of him. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him up. In the days that followed, we mounted the largest search operation in the park's history. We found no sign of Mark, Sarah, or Rodriguez. The creature's body had vanished too, leaving only a blood-stained patch of leaves. The official report blamed it on a bear attack, said we'd been confused by fear and adrenaline, that Rodriguez had likely fallen into a ravine or gotten lost in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces between the trees. I still work as a park ranger, but I've switched to desk duty. Can't bring myself to go back into those woods, because now I know the truth. We're not alone out there, and we're not at the top of the food chain. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that howl again, carried on the wind, a reminder that it's still out there, watching, waiting, hungry. And I can't help but wonder, how long before it decides to hunt again? How long before more people go missing in those dark woods? Because if there's one thing I learned that day, it's this. The wilderness doesn't just not forgive mistakes. Sometimes it actively hunts. And when it does, may God have mercy on those it sets its sights on.